Welcome to another episode of Boring History for Sleep, where we explore the fascinating yet wonderfully mundane details of medieval life. Tonight, we're venturing into the world of castles that history forgot for good reason. These aren't the mighty fortresses that withstood legendary sieges or housed powerful kings. Instead, we'll discover castles so poorly designed, so strategically useless, or so utterly impractical that they barely deserve the name.
Picture a castle built on quicksand that began sinking before construction was complete. Imagine fortifications designed by architects who apparently never considered that enemies might actually attack. We'll meet nobles who spent fortunes building defensive walls facing the wrong direction, and explore towers so poorly constructed they collapsed under their own weight. From the soggy foundations of Château de Montport in France, where the moat became a permanent lake that swallowed the gatehouse, to England's infamous crumbling keep of Lord Butterworth, which earned its name within a decade of completion, these structures represent medieval engineering at its most baffling. We'll examine castles built in locations so remote that no enemy ever bothered to attack them. Fortresses designed with fundamental flaws that made them more dangerous to their own inhabitants than to invaders, and defensive structures that served better as expensive monuments to human folly than as actual protection. Tonight's journey will take us through crumbling towers, flooded dungeons, backwards battlements, and gates that open the wrong way. We'll discover how medieval builders sometimes prioritized appearance over function, leading to castles that looked impressive from a distance but fell apart upon closer inspection. So settle in comfortably as we explore these architectural disasters, construction catastrophes, and strategic blunders that somehow earned the title of castle. Let the gentle rhythm of historical incompetence guide you toward peaceful rest as we begin with our first magnificently useless fortress. Before we delve into our collection of spectacularly pointless fortifications, we need to understand what made a castle truly useful in medieval times. The golden age of castle building stretched from roughly 1000 to 1500 CE, a period when these stone sentinels served multiple crucial functions that went far beyond simple military defense. A successful medieval castle was first and foremost a statement of power. When a lord erected towering walls and imposing keeps, he wasn't just building a home, he was broadcasting his authority across the landscape. Peasants working in distant fields could look up and see those battlements, a constant reminder of who held dominion over their lives. The very presence of a well-positioned castle could prevent rebellions before they started, simply through the psychological weight of its imposing silhouette against the sky. But castles weren't merely symbols. They served as administrative centers, the beating heart of feudal governance. Within their walls, lords collected taxes, settled disputes, and managed vast agricultural estates. The Great Hall wasn't just for feasting, it was a courthouse, a meeting place, and the nerve center of local politics. Scribes maintained records of land ownership, harvest yields, and military obligations. Without these administrative functions, the complex web of medieval society would have collapsed into chaos. Economically, castles were powerhouses of medieval commerce. They controlled trade routes, collected tolls from passing merchants, and housed workshops where skilled craftsmen produced everything from weapons to tapestries. The castle's kitchens, stables, and armories required constant supplies, creating a network of dependencies that enriched the surrounding regions. A strategically placed castle could make its lord wealthy simply by controlling a river crossing or mountain pass where merchants had no choice but to pay passage fees. From a military perspective, effective castles were positioned with surgical precision. They commanded river valleys, guarded mountain passes, or overlooked crucial road junctions. The best castle builders understood terrain like chess masters understand the board. They placed their fortifications where small garrisons could control large areas, where supply lines could be protected, and where enemy movements could be observed and disrupted. These weren't random piles of stone. They were carefully calculated instruments of medieval warfare. The architecture itself reflected these practical needs. Thick walls weren't just for show, they had to withstand months of siege warfare. Arrow slits were positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. Gatehouses were designed as elaborate death traps, forcing attackers through multiple checkpoints where defenders could rain down arrows, boiling oil, and stones. Even the spiral staircases were built to favor right-handed defenders fighting their way down, giving them room to swing their swords while forcing left-handed attackers into awkward positions. Water sources were absolutely critical. A castle without a reliable well or spring was essentially a death trap during siege warfare. The most successful fortifications either contained natural springs within their walls or had secure access to nearby rivers. Some castles featured elaborate cistern systems, collecting rainwater from rooftops and storing it in underground chambers that could sustain hundreds of people for months. Location determined everything. Castles built on high ground had obvious advantages, better visibility, harder to attack, and natural drainage for their foundation. But elevation alone wasn't enough. The ideal castle site balanced defensive advantages with practical accessibility. Too remote, and the castle became isolated from the very territories it was meant to control. Too accessible, and it became vulnerable to surprise attacks. The social dynamics within castle walls were equally important. A successful castle required a complex hierarchy of residents, not just the lord and his family, but also knights, men-at-arms, servants, craftsmen, and clergy. Each group had specific roles and living quarters. The chapel wasn't optional decoration. It was essential for maintaining morale and legitimacy. Medieval people believed deeply that God favored the righteous, so a castle without proper religious observances was seen as doomed to failure. Supply chains made or broke castle effectiveness. The most impressive walls meant nothing if the garrison starved during winter or ran out of arrows during battle. Successful castles maintained extensive networks of suppliers, from local farmers providing grain and livestock to specialized craftsmen delivering weapons and armor. Some castles operated their own mills, breweries, and workshops to reduce dependence on outside sources. Communication systems were vital but often overlooked. Effective castles maintained networks of signal fires, messenger routes, and allied fortifications. A castle that couldn't quickly send word of approaching enemies or call for reinforcements was essentially fighting blind. The best medieval lords established chains of watchtowers and smaller fortifications that could relay messages across vast distances in hours rather than days. Finally, successful castles evolved with changing military technology. The introduction of gunpowder weapons in the late medieval period forced castle builders to adapt their designs, creating lower, thicker walls and angled bastions that could deflect cannon fire. Castles that failed to modernize quickly became obsolete, their towering walls transformed from assets into liabilities. Understanding these principles of effective castle design makes our upcoming examples all the more remarkable. Because for every Warwick castle or Château de Vincennes that perfectly embodied these ideals, medieval Europe was dotted with fortifications that failed spectacularly at one or more of these essential functions. Some were built in locations so poor they might as well have been constructed on quicksand. Others were designed by architects who apparently never considered that enemies might actually try to attack them. These failures weren't just embarrassing, they were often catastrophically expensive. Medieval castle construction consumed enormous resources, sometimes bankrupting entire kingdoms. When these massive investments produced useless piles of stone, the consequences rippled through generations. Lords who built ineffective castles often found themselves conquered by neighbors who had invested more wisely in practical fortifications. So as we explore our collection of medieval Europe's most pointless castles, remember that each represents not just architectural failure, but a fascinating glimpse into the complex challenges of medieval life, where the difference between a well-placed fortress and an expensive folly could determine the fate of entire dynasties. Before we explore our collection of remarkably ineffective fortifications, let us first understand what castles were truly meant to accomplish in medieval society. The concept of a castle extends far beyond the romantic imagery of fairy tales and Hollywood productions. These structures served as complex centers of political, military, economic, and social power throughout the medieval period. The primary function of any respectable castle was defense. Medieval lords required secure positions from which they could protect their lands, their people, and most importantly themselves. A well-designed castle needed to withstand sieges that could last months or even years. The architecture itself told a story of strategic thinking, with thick walls, narrow windows, and carefully planned entry points that would funnel attackers into predetermined killing zones. Beyond mere survival, castles served as symbols of authority and legitimacy. When a lord constructed a massive stone fortress overlooking a valley, he was making a statement that could be seen for miles in every direction. The very presence of such a structure communicated power, wealth, and the divine right to rule over the surrounding territory. Peasants working in nearby fields would look up at these imposing structures and understand immediately who controlled their destiny. The economic function of castles cannot be understated in medieval society. These fortifications served as administrative centers where taxes were collected, justice was dispensed, and trade was regulated. The castle's Great Hall hosted important meetings between nobles, merchants, and church officials. Storage facilities within the castle walls held grain reserves that could sustain the local population during times of famine or siege. The castle's workshops produced everything from weapons and armor to textiles and pottery. Military strategy demanded that castles be positioned with careful consideration of the surrounding landscape. Ideal locations included hilltops that provided commanding views of approaching enemies, river crossings that controlled important trade routes, or mountain passes that served as natural choke points. The castle's position should allow defenders to observe enemy movements from great distances, while providing multiple escape routes should retreat become necessary. Communication networks relied heavily on castle positioning throughout medieval kingdoms. A properly placed castle could relay messages through smoke signals, beacon fires, or mounted messengers to other fortifications within a day's ride. This created an early warning system that allowed lords to coordinate their military responses across vast territories. The failure to maintain these communication links often resulted in isolated castles falling to enemy forces before reinforcements could arrive. Social hierarchy found its physical manifestation within castle walls. The lord and his immediate family occupied the most secure and comfortable quarters, typically located in the central keep or donjon. Knights and men-at-arms lived in barracks or smaller chambers, while servants and craftsmen were housed in the outer courtyards. This arrangement reinforced the feudal system's rigid class structure, while ensuring that the most important individuals remained protected during times of crisis. Religious considerations played a significant role in castle design and daily operations. Most castles included a chapel where the lord and his household could attend daily prayers and important religious ceremonies. The castle's chaplain often served as both spiritual advisor and record keeper, maintaining written accounts of births, deaths, marriages, and significant events. Religious festivals provided opportunities for the local population to gather within the castle's protective walls for celebration and community bonding. Technological advancement in siege warfare meant that castle designers had to constantly adapt their defensive strategies. The introduction of gunpowder weapons in the later medieval period forced architects to develop new approaches to fortification design. Walls became lower and thicker to better absorb cannon fire, while angular bastions replaced round towers to eliminate blind spots where attackers could shelter from defensive fire. Supply management represented one of the most critical aspects of castle operations. Successful fortifications required access to reliable water sources, whether through natural springs, deep wells, or connections to nearby rivers. Food storage facilities needed to maintain reserves that could sustain the castle's population for extended periods. Granaries, wine cellars, and salt storage rooms were essential components of any well-planned fortress. The psychological impact of castles extended throughout medieval society in ways that modern observers might not immediately recognize. These structures represented stability and permanence in a world where most buildings were constructed from wood and thatch. The sight of a castle's massive stone walls provided reassurance to local populations that their lord possessed the resources and determination necessary to protect them from external threats. Diplomatic functions often took place within castle walls, as these secure environments provided neutral ground for negotiations between rival factions. The castle's Great Hall served as a formal setting where treaties could be signed, marriages arranged, and territorial disputes resolved. The impressive architecture and rich decorations demonstrated the host's power and sophistication to visiting dignitaries. Maintenance requirements for medieval castles demanded significant ongoing investment in both materials and skilled labor. Stonemasons, carpenters, blacksmiths, and other craftsmen needed to be available for constant repairs and improvements. Whether damage, normal wear, and occasional siege damage required immediate attention to maintain the castle's defensive capabilities. Lords who neglected these maintenance duties often found their fortifications crumbling at the most inconvenient moments. Educational opportunities within castle walls provided young nobles with training in martial skills, courtly behavior, and administrative duties. Pages and squires learned the complex code of chivalry while developing the practical skills necessary for medieval warfare. The castle's library, though modest by modern standards, often contained the only written materials available in the surrounding region. Now that we understand the fundamental purposes that castles were meant to serve in medieval society, we can better appreciate just how spectacularly some of these fortifications failed to meet even the most basic expectations. The castles we are about to examine represent remarkable examples of poor planning, unfortunate circumstances, and occasionally breathtaking incompetence in medieval military architecture. Our journey through medieval mediocrity now takes us to the windswept coast of Wales, where Castle Llansteffan stands as perhaps the most perfectly pointless fortress ever constructed. Perched dramatically on a limestone cliff overlooking the Towy estuary, this castle appears magnificent from a distance. Yet closer inspection reveals a masterclass in strategic incompetence that would make even our previous castles seem brilliantly designed by comparison. Castle Llansteffan's story begins in the early 12th century, when the Normans decided that what Wales really needed was another half-hearted attempt at conquest. The original wooden fortification was built around 1100, during the initial Norman push into South Wales. However, the builders seem to have consulted neither military engineers nor anyone with basic common sense in selecting this particular location. The castle sits on a promontory that juts into the Towy estuary, surrounded by water on three sides. This might sound defensively advantageous, and indeed, many successful castles have been built on similar coastal positions. However, Llansteffan's builders managed to transform this natural advantage into a spectacular liability through a series of increasingly baffling design choices. The fundamental problem with Castle Llansteffan becomes apparent when you consider its purpose. Built ostensibly to control river traffic along the Towy and defend against Welsh raiders, the castle was positioned in such a way that it could accomplish neither task effectively. The estuary at this point is so wide that the castle's weapons could barely reach halfway across the water, making it essentially useless for controlling river traffic. Furthermore, the tidal nature of the estuary meant that during low tide, vast mudflats extended for hundreds of yards in every direction. Any approaching enemy could simply wait for low tide and walk across the exposed seabed, completely bypassing the castle's supposedly impregnable water defenses. It's as if the builders designed a moat that disappeared twice daily on a predictable schedule. The stone castle that replaced the original wooden structure around 1146 only compounded these problems. Built by Rhys ap Griffith, known as the Lord Rhys, the reconstruction was supposed to create a formidable Welsh stronghold that could resist Norman reconquest. Instead, created what military historians now describe as a stone monument to tactical confusion. Castle's layout defies conventional military architecture in ways that suggest either remarkable ignorance or deliberate sabotage. The main gatehouse faces inland, toward the most likely direction of attack, but it's positioned at the bottom of a gentle slope. This means that any attacking force would have the advantage of higher ground when assaulting the primary entrance. The medieval equivalent of building a front door at the bottom of your driveway and wondering why burglars find it so convenient. The castle's walls follow the natural contours of the cliff in a way that creates numerous blind spots and defensive gaps. The curtain wall, which should provide overlapping fields of fire, instead creates a series of isolated sections that cannot support each other during an attack. Defenders in one section of the wall would be unable to see or assist their comrades just a few dozen yards away. Perhaps most bizarrely, the castle includes a water gate that opens directly onto the estuary. This might seem like a practical feature for receiving supplies by boat, but the gate is positioned in such a way that it's completely unusable during high tide and completely exposed during low tide. Ships approaching at high tide cannot fit through the narrow opening, while ships approaching at low tide must navigate hundreds of yards of treacherous mudflats to reach the gate. The castle's domestic arrangements are equally perplexing. The Great Hall is positioned in the most exposed part of the castle, with large windows facing the sea that would provide excellent views for residents, but also excellent targets for enemy archers. The kitchen is located as far as possible from both the Great Hall and the main residential quarters, ensuring that every meal would be cold by the time it reached the dining table. Storage facilities within the castle are laughably inadequate for a fortress of its size. The granary could hold perhaps 2 weeks' worth of supplies for a full garrison, while the armory was barely large enough to store weapons for a dozen men. This suggests that the castle was either designed for a much smaller garrison than its size would indicate, or that the builders simply forgot that castles need to store food and weapons. The castle's well, that most crucial of defensive features, was dug in the most inconvenient location possible. Positioned in an outer courtyard that would be among the first areas to fall to attackers, the well would become useless precisely when it would be most needed. During a siege, defenders would have to venture into enemy-controlled territory just to fetch water, assuming the attackers hadn't already poisoned the well or filled it with debris. Military records from the castle's active period reveal a pattern of strategic failures that perfectly complement its architectural shortcomings. Castle Llansteffan changed hands with remarkable frequency, not because of fierce battles or clever sieges, but because it was so difficult to defend that garrisons regularly abandoned it rather than face attacking forces. In 1189, the castle was captured by the Normans not through military assault, but because the Welsh garrison simply walked away when they spotted Norman ships approaching. The attacking force later reported that they found the castle gates standing open and the walls unmanned. The Welsh defenders had apparently decided that the castle was more trouble to defend than it was worth losing their lives over. The Norman occupation lasted only 3 years before Welsh forces recaptured the castle in 1192. However, this reconquest was equally unimpressive from a military standpoint. The Welsh didn't storm the walls or conduct a siege. They simply waited for the Norman garrison to run out of supplies. The castle's inadequate storage facilities meant that the defenders were facing starvation within weeks of being cut off from external supply lines. This pattern of easy capture and abandonment continued throughout the castle's active period. Historical records show that Llansteffan changed hands at least 12 times between 1100 and 1400, with most of these transfers occurring without significant military action. The castle had become something of a medieval white elephant, expensive to maintain and impossible to defend effectively. The economic burden of maintaining Castle Llansteffan was another source of its ultimate uselessness. The castle's remote location and poor design meant that it required constant repairs and modifications that never quite solved its fundamental problems. Stone had to be transported from distant quarries, supplies had to be brought in by boat during high tide or by cart across difficult terrain, and skilled craftsmen had to be convinced to work in what was essentially a strategic dead end. Local records indicate that the cost of maintaining Llansteffan exceeded the revenue it generated through taxes and customs duties by a factor of 3 to 1. The castle was literally bleeding money while providing no meaningful defensive or administrative benefit to its owners. It's remarkable that anyone continued to occupy it for as long as they did. By the 14th century, even the most optimistic military planners had to acknowledge that Castle Llansteffan was fundamentally flawed beyond repair. The rise of gunpowder weapons only made its problems worse, as the castle's walls were too thin to withstand cannon fire, and its layout provided no adequate positions for defensive artillery. The final military action at Castle Llansteffan occurred in 1403 during Onton Glyndwr's Welsh revolt. However, this wasn't a dramatic siege or heroic last stand. The English garrison, consisting of just 6 men and a sergeant, surrendered immediately when they saw Welsh forces approaching. They reportedly left a note apologizing for the state of the castle and suggesting that it might be better used as a sheep pen.
The morning sun cast long shadows across Llansteffan's weathered walls as the garrison prepared for another day of absolutely nothing happening. Sir Gareth had developed a routine that would have impressed even the most dedicated monastery brothers. Wake at dawn, inspect the same 4 walls, count the same 17 sheep in the distant field, and wonder why anyone thought this particular hill needed defending.
The castle's great hall, if it could be called great, measured roughly the size of a modest barn. Its single hearth struggled to warm the space during winter months, leaving the corners perpetually damp and musty. The walls, built from local limestone, had developed an unfortunate tendency to weep moisture during the frequent Welsh rains. This created fascinating patterns of green and black mold that Sir Gareth had begun cataloging out of sheer boredom. The kitchen, located in what architects generously termed the service wing, consisted of a single room with a cooking fire and a small pantry. The castle's cook, a weathered woman named Bronwyn, had mastered the art of creating 17 different variations of mutton stew. She claimed this was due to her culinary creativity, but everyone knew it was because mutton was literally the only meat available within a day's ride. The castle's defensive capabilities were, to put it charitably, limited. The main gate consisted of a wooden door reinforced with iron bands, secured by a bar that 3 men could lift if they worked together and weren't suffering from back problems. There was no portcullis, no murder holes, and certainly no sophisticated defensive mechanism. The moat was actually a natural depression that filled with rainwater and served primarily as a breeding ground for particularly aggressive mosquitoes. Sir Gareth's daily routine included what he called perimeter inspection, which involved walking around the castle walls and noting any changes since the previous day. These changes were invariably limited to new bird droppings, slightly different arrangements of fallen leaves, or the occasional dead rodent. He had developed an elaborate system of documentation, recording these observations in a leather-bound journal that would have fascinated absolutely no one. The castle's armory contained 12 rusty swords, 8 dented shields, and a collection of spears that had seen better decades. The crossbows, inherited from the previous garrison, had strings that snapped with alarming regularity. Sir Gareth had become quite skilled at restringing them, though he questioned the wisdom of maintaining weapons that would never see combat. The soldiers under Sir Gareth's command had developed their own coping mechanisms for the crushing monotony. Young Thomas had become an expert at identifying different types of clouds and could predict weather patterns with remarkable accuracy. Owen had taught himself to whittle elaborate figures from driftwood that occasionally washed up from the nearby estuary. These artistic endeavors had progressed from simple animals to complex human figures, though their resemblance to actual humans remained questionable. The castle's chapel, a modest stone structure attached to the main keep, saw more use than any military facility. Father Benedict, the resident priest, had initially planned to hold services twice weekly. However, the combination of boredom and the need for spiritual guidance in such trying circumstances had led to daily masses, evening prayers, and spontaneous services whenever someone felt particularly overwhelmed by the meaninglessness of their situation. Communication with the outside world occurred through a monthly supply wagon that arrived with provisions and news from the broader kingdom. The wagon driver, a grizzled man named Caddock, had become the castle's primary source of entertainment. His stories of events in distant towns and cities were received with the enthusiasm typically reserved for royal proclamations or divine revelations. The castle's record-keeping had evolved into an art form of bureaucratic precision. Sir Gareth maintained detailed logs of daily activities, weather conditions, supply consumption, and personnel status. These records, written in careful script on precious parchment, documented the most thoroughly boring military assignment in the kingdom's history. Future historians would either marvel at the dedication to documentation or question the sanity of everyone involved. The surrounding countryside offered little in the way of diversion or strategic importance. The nearest village, Llansteffan proper, consisted of perhaps 30 houses, a small church, and a tavern that served ale of questionable quality. The villagers were friendly enough, but had grown accustomed to the castle's irrelevance. They went about their daily lives of farming, fishing, and raising families without giving much thought to the fortress that supposedly protected them from threats that never materialized. The castle's location, while scenic, highlighted its fundamental uselessness. Perched on a hill overlooking the Toey estuary, it commanded impressive views of water, marshland, and distant mountains. However, these views served no military purpose whatsoever. No enemy armies marched through the marshes, no hostile ships sailed up the estuary, and no strategic resources required protection. Sir Gareth had begun composing letters to his superiors requesting reassignment, but these missives remained unfinished in his desk drawer. How does one explain that a castle assignment is too boring to endure? Military protocol demanded stoic acceptance of orders, regardless of their apparent pointlessness. Complaining about the lack of combat seemed to contradict the very nature of a soldier's duty. The castle's financial situation reflected its strategic worthlessness. The annual budget for maintaining Llansteffan was minimal, covering basic supplies, soldier wages, and essential repairs. No funds were allocated for improvements, expansion, or modernization because everyone understood that such investments would be throwing good money after bad. The castle existed in a state of managed decline, maintained just enough to avoid complete collapse. Winter at Llansteffan brought its own unique challenges. The castle's heating system, such as it was, consisted of fireplaces in the main hall and a few smaller chambers. Fuel came from the surrounding forest, requiring regular wood-gathering expeditions that had become the highlight of many soldiers' weeks. These trips provided opportunities to interact with local woodsmen, hunt small game, and temporarily escape the castle's oppressive atmosphere of purposelessness. The castle's water supply came from a well dug into the hillside, providing clean but unremarkable water year-round. This reliability was perhaps the castle's most genuinely useful feature, though it hardly justified the expense of maintaining an entire fortress. The well had been dug by the original builders and required minimal maintenance, making it infinitely more practical than the defensive structures surrounding it. As months turned to years, the garrison developed an almost philosophical acceptance of their situation. They had become curators of irrelevance, guardians of emptiness, protectors of nothing in particular. Their service at Llansteffan had transformed from military duty into an extended meditation on the nature of purpose and meaning in an indifferent universe.
Deep in the forests of northern France, where morning mist clings to ancient oak trees, and the air carries the scent of damp earth and centuries-old stone, stands one of medieval history's most peculiar architectural achievements. Château de Pierrefonds rises from its wooded hillside like something from a fairy tale, its towers and turrets reaching toward gray skies with an almost theatrical grandeur. Yet this magnificent fortress, despite its imposing appearance and strategic location, would earn its place in history not for great battles won or sieges withstood, but for its remarkable ability to serve absolutely no meaningful military purpose whatsoever.
The story of Pierrefonds begins in the late 14th century, during a time when France was torn apart by civil war, and the kingdom seemed to fracture along the lines of noble ambition and royal weakness. In 1396, Louis of Orleans, brother to the mentally unstable King Charles VI, decided that what France truly needed was another massive fortress. Not because any particular military threat demanded it, mind you, but because Louis had developed something of an obsession with castle construction that bordered on the compulsive. Louis of Orleans was a man of peculiar enthusiasms and questionable judgment. While his brother, the king, suffered from bouts of madness that left him believing he was made of glass and would shatter if touched, Louis channeled his own eccentricities into an almost manic passion for architectural projects. He had already begun construction on several other castles throughout his domain, each one more elaborate and less practical than the last. Pierrefonds would become his masterpiece of military irrelevance. The location chosen for this grand fortress was, admittedly, quite beautiful. Situated on a rocky outcrop overlooking the village of Pierrefonds, surrounded by the dense Campigny forest, the site offered commanding views of the surrounding countryside. Ancient Roman roads passed nearby, and the position controlled access to several important river valleys. On paper, it seemed like an ideal spot for a military stronghold. In practice, however, the location's strategic value was roughly equivalent to that of a very expensive garden ornament. Construction began with great fanfare and considerable expense. Louis spared no cost in his vision, importing master masons from across Europe and commissioning elaborate architectural plans that would make Pierrefonds one of the most visually striking castles in all of France. The design called for massive round towers, elaborate machicolations, and defensive features that looked impressively medieval while serving little actual defensive purpose. It was as if someone had decided to build a castle based entirely on what they thought a castle should look like, rather than what a castle needed to do. The master mason entrusted with this ambitious project was a man whose name has been lost to history, though his work speaks to both considerable skill and a certain disconnect from military reality. The walls he designed were thick and imposing, certainly, but they incorporated decorative elements that actively compromised their defensive capabilities. Elaborate windows were placed at heights that would allow attackers easy access with scaling ladders. Ornamental projections provided convenient handholds for anyone attempting to climb the walls. The overall design prioritized aesthetic appeal over practical defense in ways that would have made any experienced military engineer weep with frustration. As construction progressed through the early years of the 15th century, it became increasingly clear that Pierrefonds was destined to be more monument than fortress. The great round towers rose majestically from their foundations, their walls adorned with carved stonework that must have cost a fortune, but added nothing to their defensive value. The main keep, when finally completed, resembled something more suited to hosting elaborate court festivities than withstanding a determined siege. Every architectural choice seemed calculated to impress visitors rather than deter attackers. The irony of Pierrefonds' construction was that while Louis of Orleans poured enormous resources into building this magnificent fortress, the real military threats to his power were developing in the political sphere rather than on any battlefield where castle walls might matter. The ongoing civil war between the Armagnacs and Burgundians was being fought through assassination, political maneuvering, and urban warfare in Paris and other major cities. The age of great castle sieges was already passing, and conflicts were increasingly decided by factors that had nothing to do with how impressive your fortress looked from a distance. Yet Louis continued to lavish attention and money on his pet project, apparently oblivious to its growing irrelevance. The castle's great hall was designed to accommodate hundreds of guests for elaborate banquets and celebrations. The residential quarters were fitted with luxurious appointments that would have been more appropriate in a palace than a military installation. Elaborate gardens were planned for the interior courtyards, complete with fountains and decorative plantings that would require constant maintenance and provide excellent cover for any attackers who somehow managed to breach the outer walls. The defensive features that were included in the design often seemed more theoretical than practical. The murder holes in the gatehouse were positioned in ways that would make them difficult to use effectively. The arrow slits in the walls were sized and angled for aesthetic balance rather than optimal fields of fire. The machicolations that crowned the towers looked magnificent, but were designed with gaps and blind spots that any competent siege engineer could have exploited with ease. It was as if the entire castle had been designed by someone whose knowledge of military architecture came entirely from illuminated manuscripts rather than actual battlefield experience. By 1407, construction had progressed far enough that the castle was beginning to take its final form, and that form was undeniably impressive. Visitors approaching through the forest would have been struck by the sight of those great towers rising above the tree line, their conical roofs and elaborate stonework creating a silhouette that seemed to embody everything romantic and noble about medieval architecture. The main entrance, when finally completed, featured a drawbridge and portcullis that looked every inch the part of a proper castle gateway, even if their actual defensive value was questionable at best. The timing of Pierrefonds' completion could hardly have been worse from a military perspective. Just as the castle was reaching a state where it might theoretically have been used for its intended defensive purposes, the nature of warfare was changing in ways that made such elaborate fortifications increasingly obsolete. Gunpowder weapons were becoming more common and more effective. Artillery was beginning to make high stone walls more of a liability than an asset. The future of military architecture lay in low, thick-walled star forts designed to deflect cannon fire, not in soaring towers that presented perfect targets for bombardment. But perhaps most tellingly, Louis of Orleans himself seemed to have little interest in actually using his magnificent castle for any military purpose. Historical records suggest that he visited Pierrefonds primarily for hunting expeditions and elaborate court entertainment. The castle's great hall hosted feasts and celebrations, its chambers accommodated visiting nobles and their retinues, and its grounds served as the setting for tournaments and other chivalric displays. It functioned, in other words, as exactly what it had always been designed to be, an extremely expensive stage set for playing at being medieval nobles. The forest surrounding Pierrefonds added to its fairy tale atmosphere, while simultaneously highlighting its military uselessness. Those dense woods that made the castle so picturesque also provided perfect cover for any attacking force. The ancient oaks and thick undergrowth would allow enemies to approach within a few hundred yards of the walls without being detected. The very feature that made the location so romantically appealing also made it tactically indefensible. A proper military fortress would have required cleared fields of fire, extending far beyond arrow range. Pierrefonds was surrounded by what amounted to a natural camouflage network for hostile forces. As we drift deeper into the story of this magnificent folly, we find ourselves in that peculiar space where ambition meets reality, where the dreams of medieval grandeur encounter the practical limitations of actual military necessity. The stones of Pierrefonds hold within them the echoes of countless hours of skilled labor, enormous financial investment, and genuine artistic achievement, all devoted to creating something that would prove to be fundamentally useless for its stated purpose. In the gentle shadows of those ancient towers, we can almost hear the whispers of history itself, telling us the story of how good intentions and unlimited resources can combine to create something simultaneously magnificent and utterly pointless.
The restoration of Château de Pierrefonds became an exercise in medieval fantasy rather than historical preservation. Violet Leduc approached the project with the enthusiasm of a novelist writing historical fiction, prioritizing dramatic effect over archaeological accuracy. He envisioned towers that soared higher than their medieval predecessors, walls that gleamed with fresh stonework, and interiors that sparkled with 19th century interpretations of medieval grandeur.
The architect's vision transformed the ruins into something that had never truly existed. Medieval castles were practical structures built for defense and daily life, often cramped and uncomfortable by modern standards. They were patched and repaired over centuries, creating a patchwork of architectural styles and building techniques. Viollet-le-Duc's restoration eliminated this organic evolution, creating instead a pristine medieval theme park that looked more like a fairy tale illustration than a genuine historical site. The project consumed enormous resources throughout the 1860s and 1870s. Teams of stonemasons worked to recreate decorative elements that may never have existed in the original castle. Sculptors carved elaborate gargoyles and ornamental details based on Viollet-le-Duc's imagination rather than archaeological evidence. The restoration employed hundreds of craftsmen and consumed tons of stone, all in service of creating a medieval fantasy that would satisfy Napoleon III's romantic vision of French history. Contemporary critics began questioning the restoration even as work continued. Archaeological societies raised concerns about the lack of scientific methodology in the project. Historians pointed out that the restored castle bore little resemblance to what medieval Pierrefonds would actually have looked like. The building was becoming a magnificent monument to 19th century ideas about the Middle Ages rather than a genuine medieval structure. The interior spaces reveal the most dramatic departures from historical accuracy. Medieval great halls were typically austere spaces with minimal decoration. Their walls often bear stone or covered with simple tapestries. Viollet-le-Duc created elaborate painted ceilings, ornate carved woodwork, and decorative schemes that would have been impossibly expensive and impractical for a medieval lord. The restored apartments featured modern conveniences disguised as medieval elements, creating comfortable living spaces that bore no resemblance to the harsh realities of medieval castle life. The chapel restoration exemplifies these anachronistic choices. Medieval castle chapels were usually simple affairs, with basic stone altars and minimal decoration. The restored chapel at Pierrefonds features elaborate carved stonework, painted vaulting, and decorative elements that reflect 19th century Gothic revival aesthetics rather than medieval religious architecture. Every surface gleams with fresh paint and gilding, creating an atmosphere more reminiscent of a Victorian church than a medieval place of worship. The castle's defensive features received similar treatment. Medieval fortifications were pragmatic structures, designed for maximum military effectiveness with minimal regard for aesthetic appeal. Arrow slits were narrow and functional, walls were thick and unadorned, and defensive positions were chosen for tactical advantage rather than scenic views. Viollet-le-Duc's restoration emphasized the romantic aspects of medieval warfare while downplaying its brutal realities. The restored towers showcased this romanticized approach to medieval architecture. Each tower received elaborate conical roofs that soared dramatically against the sky, creating a silhouette more suitable for a Disney castle than a medieval fortress. The original towers would have had simpler, more practical roof lines designed to shed rain and snow efficiently. The restored versions prioritize visual impact over historical accuracy or practical function. The project's completion in the 1880s marked the creation of one of Europe's most beautiful fake medieval castles. Pierrefonds had become a masterpiece of 19th century craftsmanship disguised as medieval architecture. Visitors could walk through halls that had never echoed with medieval footsteps, climb stairs that medieval lords had never ascended, and admire views from windows that had never framed medieval landscapes. The castle's role as imperial residence proved short-lived. Napoleon III's empire collapsed in 1870, and the restored Pierrefonds became a white elephant of monumental proportions. The French Republic inherited a magnificent but essentially useless building that served no practical purpose beyond tourism and national prestige. The castle that had been rebuilt to house an emperor now stood empty, its elaborate rooms echoing with the absence of their intended occupants. Modern visitors to Château de Pierrefonds encounter this paradox with every step. The building is undeniably magnificent, its restored halls and towers creating an atmosphere of medieval grandeur that takes the breath away. Yet every architectural detail represents a 19th century fantasy rather than medieval reality. The castle succeeds brilliantly as a work of romantic imagination while failing completely as a historical document. The restoration's influence on popular perceptions of medieval architecture cannot be overstated. Pierrefonds became the template for countless fairy tale castles in literature, film, and theme parks. Soaring towers and pristine stonework established visual expectations for medieval architecture that actual medieval buildings rarely meet. The castle's fake medieval perfection became more influential than genuine medieval ruins in shaping modern ideas about the Middle Ages. Archaeological investigations in recent decades have revealed the extent of Viollet Reduct's creative liberties. Ground-penetrating radar and careful excavation have uncovered evidence of the original medieval structures, showing how dramatically the restoration departed from historical reality. The original castle was smaller, simpler, and far less ornate than its 19th century replacement. These discoveries have transformed Pierrefonds from a medieval monument into a monument to 19th century medievalism. The castle's current status as a historical monument reflects this complex identity. It is protected not as a medieval building, but as an outstanding example of 19th century restoration work. Visitors come to admire Viollet Reduct's vision rather than medieval craftsmanship. The building has become a fascinating artifact of Romantic historicism, valuable precisely because of its departure from historical accuracy. Conservation efforts now focus on preserving the 19th century restoration rather than uncovering medieval remains. The elaborate painted decorations, carved stonework, and architectural fantasies created by Viollet Reduct require constant maintenance to prevent deterioration. Ironically, the fake medieval castle now needs the same careful preservation efforts typically reserved for genuine historical monuments. Deep in the Scottish borderlands, where morning mist clings to ancient stones like forgotten memories, stands Caerlaverock Castle. Its triangular silhouette rises from the marshy ground with all the imposing presence of a medieval fortress, yet this castle holds the dubious distinction of being one of history's most spectacularly useless defensive structures. Built in the 13th century by the Maxwell family, Caerlaverock was designed to guard the western approach to Scotland from English invasion. What it actually accomplished was creating a monument to architectural overconfidence and strategic miscalculation. The very name Caerlaverock translates roughly to Fort of the Lark, which should have been the first warning sign. When your castle is named after a small songbird rather than something intimidating like Fortress of Death or Keep of Eternal Doom, you might want to reconsider your branding strategy. The Maxwell lords, however, were undeterred by such considerations. They had grander visions than mere practicality. Construction began around 1270, during a period when the Scottish borders were becoming increasingly volatile. The English were making their usual territorial advances, and Scottish nobles were scrambling to fortify their lands. The Maxwell family, being prominent landowners in Dumfriesshire, decided they needed a castle that would serve as both a defensive stronghold and a symbol of their power. What they created instead was an architectural curiosity that would puzzle military historians for centuries to come. The most immediately striking feature of Caerlaverock is its unique triangular design. While most medieval castles followed rectangular or circular plans, Caerlaverock was built as an almost perfect triangle, with massive round towers at two corners and a twin-towered gatehouse forming the third point. This unusual shape was supposedly chosen to make the most efficient use of the rocky outcrop on which it was built, but the result was a fortress that looked more like a geometric experiment than a serious military installation. The triangular layout created immediate problems that any competent military engineer should have foreseen. The sharp angles where the walls met created blind spots that attackers could exploit, areas where defenders on the walls couldn't see or effectively target enemies. These dead zones essentially provided free cover for anyone attempting to scale the walls or plant explosives. It was as if the architects had deliberately designed convenient hiding spots for their enemies. The castle's location presented another series of challenges that seemed to have been overlooked during the planning phase. Caerlaverock was built on the edge of the Solway Firth, surrounded by treacherous marshland that was supposedly meant to serve as a natural defensive barrier. In theory, this made sense. Enemies would have difficulty approaching through the boggy terrain. In practice, it meant that the castle's own supply lines were equally compromised. Getting food, weapons, and reinforcements to the castle during times of siege became a logistical nightmare. The marshy ground also created structural problems that plagued the castle throughout its existence. The soft, waterlogged soil provided an unstable foundation for such a massive stone structure. The walls began settling and cracking almost immediately after construction, requiring constant repairs and reinforcement. What was meant to be an impregnable fortress became a money pit that consumed the Maxwell family's resources in endless maintenance costs. The castle's defensive features, while impressive in appearance, were poorly thought out from a practical standpoint. The great gatehouse with its twin towers and elaborate stonework was certainly imposing to look at, but it was also the castle's greatest weakness. The entrance was positioned at ground level, making it easily accessible to attackers with battering rams. Most well-designed castles of the period featured elevated entrances or complex approach routes that would slow down assault forces, but Caerlaverock's builders seem to have prioritized architectural drama over defensive effectiveness. The interior layout of the castle further demonstrated the triumph of form over function. The triangular courtyard was cramped and awkward, making it difficult to organize troops or store supplies efficiently. The unusual shape meant that buildings within the walls had to be custom designed to fit the available space, resulting in oddly shaped halls and chambers that were both expensive to build and impractical to use. The Great Hall, squeezed into one corner of the triangle, was notably smaller than those found in comparable castles of the period. Perhaps most tellingly, the castle's military history reads like a catalog of failures and surrenders. Caerlaverock's first major test came in 1296, when Edward I of England launched his campaign to conquer Scotland. The English forces approached the castle with a large army, expecting a prolonged siege. Instead, they found a fortress that looked impressive from a distance but crumbled under the first serious assault. The garrison surrendered after just 2 days of fighting, barely long enough for the attackers to set up their siege engines properly. The speed of this surrender became something of a running joke among military chroniclers at the time. One contemporary account described the siege as lasting scarcely longer than it takes to eat a good meal, which was medieval military humor at its finest. The English were so surprised by the quick capitulation that they initially suspected a trap, spending several more days cautiously approaching the walls before realizing that the Scots had genuinely given up without a real fight. After the English conquest, Caerlaverock changed hands repeatedly, often without any fighting whatsoever. The castle's reputation for easy surrender had preceded it, and subsequent attackers often found that simply showing up with a reasonable force was enough to convince the defenders to negotiate terms. This pattern of bloodless capitulation continued throughout the Scottish Wars of Independence, making Caerlaverock something of an embarrassment to Scottish military pride. The Maxwell family, to their credit, kept trying to make their castle work as intended. They invested heavily in upgrades and improvements, adding new defensive features and strengthening the walls. Each modification, however, seemed to create new problems while failing to solve the existing ones. The triangular design remained fundamentally flawed, and no amount of additional stonework could change the basic geometric disadvantages built into the structure. One particularly expensive renovation in the early 14th century attempted to address the blind spot problem by adding projecting towers at strategic points along the walls. These additions were supposed to provide overlapping fields of fire that would eliminate the dead zones. Instead, they created a confusing maze of conflicting sight lines that made it difficult for defenders to coordinate their efforts. Archers found themselves shooting past their own comrades, and the additional towers provided more targets for enemy siege engines without significantly improving the castle's defensive capabilities. The castle's water supply presented another ongoing challenge that the original designers had failed to adequately address. While the surrounding marshland provided plenty of water, it was often brackish and unsuitable for drinking. The castle's well had to be dug extremely deep to reach fresh water, and even then, the supply was unreliable during dry seasons. During sieges, when the garrison was cut off from outside sources, water shortages became a critical vulnerability that enemies could exploit simply by waiting. The morning sun cast long shadows across Caerlaverock's triangular walls as Sir Eustace de Maxwell surveyed his domain from the gatehouse tower. The year was 1300, and reports had reached him of English forces massing near Carlisle. He adjusted his woolen cloak against the Scottish morning chill and wondered, not for the first time, why his grandfather had chosen to build their stronghold in such an exposed position. Below in the courtyard, servants moved with the unhurried pace of those who had grown accustomed to the rhythms of castle life. The blacksmith's hammer rang against iron, creating new horseshoes that would likely see more use in retreat than in glorious charges. The castle's design, while architecturally striking, presented numerous challenges for its defenders that were becoming increasingly apparent with each passing season. The triangular shape that made Caerlaverock so distinctive also created peculiar acoustic properties within its walls. Conversations held in one corner of the courtyard could be heard clearly in another, making private discussions nearly impossible. Sir Eustace had learned to conduct sensitive matters in a small chamber above the gatehouse, where the constant whistle of wind through the arrow slits provided natural masking for important conversation. The castle's kitchens occupied the eastern wall, positioned there to take advantage of the morning sun for food preparation. However, this placement meant that cooking fires had to be carefully managed to prevent smoke from obscuring the view from the battlements during crucial morning watch periods. The head cook, a stout woman named Agnes, had developed an intricate system of dampers and flues to control the smoke flow, though it required constant attention from her assistants. Water supply remained one of Caerlaverock's most persistent challenges. While the castle possessed a well in the courtyard, the water table in the marshy ground fluctuated dramatically with the seasons. During particularly wet years, the well would overflow, creating muddy conditions throughout the lower bailey. In dry summers, the water level would drop so low that drawing water required increasingly longer ropes and considerable effort from the servants. The castle's stables, built into the northern wall, could accommodate perhaps 20 horses at most. For a fortress that might need to house a significant garrison during times of conflict, this limitation proved particularly problematic. Additional horses had to be kept in temporary shelters outside the walls, making them vulnerable to raids and requiring additional guards to protect them. Sir Eustace often walked the battlements in the evening, observing how the setting sun illuminated the surrounding countryside. The view was undeniably beautiful, with the Solway Firth stretching toward the horizon and the distant mountains of the Lake District visible on clear days. Yet the same openness that provided such scenic vistas also meant that approaching armies could be spotted from miles away, giving enemies ample time to prepare for siege or simply bypass the castle entirely. The Great Hall occupied much of the castle's interior space, its high ceiling designed to impress visitors with the Maxwell family's status and wealth. Tapestries depicting hunting scenes and family heraldry hung from the stone walls, while a massive fireplace dominated the western end of the hall. However, heating such a large space proved expensive and inefficient, requiring enormous quantities of wood that had to be transported from increasingly distant forests as local supplies dwindled. During winter months, the hall's occupants would cluster near the fireplace, leaving the far end of the room cold and unused. Sir Eustace had considered having smaller chambers constructed within the hall to create more intimate and easily heated spaces, but the expense of such modifications, combined with the uncertainty of the political situation, made such improvements impractical. The castle's chapel, built into the southern wall, served the spiritual needs of the garrison and household. A single stained glass window, depicting St. Andrew, cast colored light across the stone altar during morning prayers. The chapel's acoustics were excellent for singing, though the same properties that enhanced hymns also amplified every cough, whisper, and shuffling foot during services, making it difficult for the chaplain to maintain the solemnity appropriate to religious observances. Storage presented another ongoing challenge within Caerlaverock's unique design. The triangular layout created numerous odd-shaped spaces that were difficult to use efficiently. Barrels of grain and salt had to be carefully positioned to fit properly, and even then, much potential storage space remained unused due to awkward angles and corners. The castle's steward, Master Robert, had become expert at calculating exactly how much could be stored in each available space, though his calculations often proved optimistic when it came time to actually position the supplies. The armory occupied a chamber in the gatehouse tower, chosen for its security and accessibility. Here, swords, spears, crossbows, and armor were maintained in ready condition. However, the room's circular shape made it difficult to arrange weapons efficiently, and the narrow spiral staircase leading to it meant that moving larger pieces of armor or siege equipment required considerable effort and planning. Sir Eustace maintained a small library in his private chambers, containing perhaps a dozen books on subjects ranging from military strategy to estate management. These volumes, painstakingly copied by monks and purchased at considerable expense, represented a significant investment in knowledge. Yet the damp conditions common to Scottish castles required constant vigilance to prevent the precious manuscripts from developing mold or suffering damage from moisture. The castle's defenses, while formidable in appearance, had never been seriously tested by a determined enemy. The high walls and strong gatehouse certainly looked impressive, but military engineers who visited Caerlaverock often noted that the triangular design created potential weak points where attackers might concentrate their efforts. The corners of the triangle in particular were subject to structural stresses that could potentially be exploited by skilled sappers. As autumn approached in that year of 1300, Sir Eustace found himself increasingly preoccupied with reports of English military preparations. King Edward's reputation for thorough and methodical warfare was well known throughout Scotland, and the Maxwell family's previous conflicts with English forces had demonstrated the limitations of even the strongest fortifications when faced with overwhelming numbers and superior siege equipment. The castle's servants went about their daily routines with the practiced efficiency of those who had adapted to their unique environment. The peculiarities of Caerlaverock's design had shaped their work patterns over the years, creating customs and procedures that would seem strange to servants in more conventionally designed castles. Yet these adaptations had also created a sense of community and shared purpose among the household members. Evening meals in the Great Hall followed established patterns that had evolved to accommodate the room's acoustic properties and heating challenges. Tables were arranged to keep diners close to the fireplace while still maintaining proper precedence among the various ranks of household members. Conversations were conducted in carefully modulated tones to prevent them from echoing embarrassingly throughout the hall. As night fell over Caerlaverock Castle, Sir Eustace would often stand at his chamber window, looking out over the darkened countryside and contemplating the uncertain future that lay ahead for his family and their distinctive triangular stronghold. Deep in the heart of Snowdonia, where mist clings to ancient peaks and sheep-dot emerald hillsides, stands the crumbling remains of Castle Bere. This Welsh fortress, built in the 13th century, represents perhaps one of the most spectacularly pointless military investments in medieval history. Its story begins not with grand ambition, but with the desperate flailing of a prince who fundamentally misunderstood both geography and politics. Llewellyn ap Gruffydd, the last native prince of Wales, commissioned this castle around 1221, choosing a location that would make even the most optimistic military strategist weep. Perched on a rocky outcrop in the Dyson Valley, Castle Bere commanded absolutely nothing of strategic value. No major trade routes passed beneath its walls. No vital river crossings lay within its influence. The castle gazed majestically over miles of sheep pasture and the occasional bewildered shepherd. The site selection process for Castle Bere appears to have involved someone pointing at a map while blindfolded. The castle sits roughly 15 miles inland from the coast, too far to control any maritime approaches. It's positioned away from the main mountain passes that armies might actually use. Instead, it overlooks a valley so peaceful and strategically irrelevant that its primary function seemed to be providing an excellent vantage point for counting livestock. Construction began with the kind of enthusiasm typically reserved for more sensible projects. Welsh stonemasons hauled blocks of local stone up the steep hillside, creating walls that were genuinely impressive in their craftsmanship. The main gatehouse rose to an imposing height, complete with murder holes and defensive features that would have been terrifying to any enemy foolish enough to attack a castle that controlled absolutely nothing worth conquering. The castle's design followed conventional wisdom of the period, featuring a strong curtain wall, residential quarters, and defensive towers. What it lacked was any reasonable justification for existing in that particular location. Military engineers of the time understood the importance of controlling river crossings, mountain passes, or major roadways. Castle Bere controlled sheep migration patterns and seasonal grazing rights. Llewellyn's strategic thinking becomes even more puzzling when you consider the broader political landscape. Edward I of England was systematically conquering Wales, building a ring of truly formidable castles at strategically vital locations. Caernarfon controlled the Menai Strait, Harlech dominated the coastal approaches, Conway commanded a major river crossing. Meanwhile, Castle Bere sat in splendid isolation, perfectly positioned to defend against attacks by particularly aggressive flocks of Welsh mountain sheep. The castle's garrison must have experienced levels of boredom previously unknown to medieval warfare. Their daily routine likely involved long periods of staring at empty hillsides, interrupted by the occasional excitement of watching shepherds move their flocks from one pasture to another. The most dramatic events in the castle's early years probably involved disputes over grazing rights and the annual sheep shearing competition. Archaeological evidence suggests that Castle Bere was built to accommodate a significant garrison, with barrack space for dozens of soldiers. These men found themselves defending one of the most peaceful locations in medieval Wales. Their weapons remained sharp through lack of use. Their armor stayed polished because it never saw combat. They became the most well-rested military force in the Principality, which would have been admirable if rest had been the strategic objective. The castle's kitchens were designed to feed a large household, complete with multiple hearths and storage areas for provisions. The irony was that Castle Bere sat in one of the most food-secure locations imaginable. The surrounding valleys provided abundant sheep, cattle, and agricultural produce. The siege would have been more of an extended camping trip, with the attackers enjoying fresh mutton and local cheese while waiting for the defenders to surrender out of sheer embarrassment. Communication with other Welsh strongholds proved challenging due to Castel Bere's isolated position. Signal fires could be lit on the towers, but they would primarily alert nearby shepherds rather than military allies. Messages had to be carried by horsemen across difficult terrain, often taking days to reach destinations that could have been reached in hours from more sensibly located fortresses. The castle's chapel reflects the religious devotion of its builders, featuring carved stonework and space for regular services. Here at least the garrison found purpose in their daily prayers, though one suspects many of those prayers involved requests for something interesting to happen. The chaplain's sermons likely focused heavily on patience and the virtue of waiting, themes that resonated deeply with soldiers who spent their days watching grass grow. Castel Bere's water supply came from a well dug deep into the rocky foundation, providing clean, reliable water that would have been the envy of many more strategically important castles. This engineering achievement represented perhaps the most practical aspect of the entire project. At least the garrison would never die of thirst while they waited for someone to explain why they were there. The castle's stables could accommodate horses for the garrison and visiting dignitaries, though visitors were rare given the location's remoteness. The horses probably enjoyed more stimulating lives than their riders, at least getting regular exercise during patrols of the surrounding countryside. These patrols served no military purpose, but did provide excellent opportunities for the soldiers to develop their sheep-counting skills. Local Welsh lords initially supported the castle's construction, viewing it as a symbol of native resistance against English expansion. However, their enthusiasm waned as they realized that Castel Bere's contribution to Welsh independence would be largely symbolic. The castle could inspire patriotic feelings, but it couldn't actually stop English armies, influence trade, or control territory in any meaningful way. The fortress featured a great hall where important meetings could be held, though the definition of important became increasingly flexible given the castle's irrelevance to major political events. Discussions likely centered on livestock management, weather patterns, and philosophical questions about the nature of military service in peacetime. The hall's acoustics were excellent, ensuring that even the most trivial conversations echoed impressively off the stone walls.
The builders of Castel Bere faced challenges that would make modern construction workers weep into their hard hats. Every single stone had to be carried up the mountainside by hand, or perhaps by the occasional, very patient donkey. The logistics alone were nightmarish. Imagine trying to coordinate the delivery of limestone blocks when your castle sits on a peak that requires a 45-minute hike just to reach the construction site.
The Welsh workers, bless their determined hearts, developed an intricate system of pulleys and ramps that snaked up the mountainside like a medieval roller coaster. Archaeological evidence suggests they built temporary wooden platforms at various elevations, creating staging areas where materials could rest before the final push to the summit. It was ingenious, really, if you ignore the fact that they were essentially building the world's most expensive pile of rocks in the middle of nowhere. Prince Llewellyn ap Gruffydd had grand visions for his mountain fortress. The castle would feature a great hall capable of hosting royal banquets, though one wonders who exactly would make the treacherous journey up the mountain for dinner. The kitchen facilities were designed to serve elaborate meals, complete with multiple hearths and storage areas for wine and provisions. This optimism is touching when you consider that most visitors probably arrived exhausted, dehydrated, and questioning their life choices. The Great Hall itself was a marvel of medieval architecture, stretching nearly 60 feet in length with soaring stone arches that created an impressive acoustic environment. The sound of conversations would echo dramatically off the walls, which was wonderful for creating atmosphere but terrible for keeping secrets. Every whispered conspiracy would bounce around the chamber like a medieval game of telephone, ensuring that even the most mundane dinner conversation became an unintentional public announcement. Construction crews worked in shifts, with some sleeping in temporary shelters built directly into the mountainside. These weren't cozy accommodations by any stretch of the imagination. Workers huddled together in stone lean-tos that offered minimal protection from the Welsh weather, which, as anyone familiar with Wales can attest, involves approximately 11 months of rain followed by a brief period of slightly less rain. The castle's water supply presented another delightful challenge that the architects somehow failed to fully consider during the planning phase. While there was a natural spring nearby, it was located about 300 yards down the slope, which meant that every drop of water had to be carried uphill in buckets. The daily water brigade became a constant feature of castle life, with servants trudging up and down the mountain path like medieval fitness enthusiasts, engaged in the world's most pointless workout routine. During winter months, the water situation became even more entertaining. The spring would sometimes freeze, and the path became treacherously icy, turning the simple act of fetching water into an extreme sport. Castle records, what few survived, mention several incidents of servants sliding dramatically down the mountainside while attempting to carry water buckets, creating impromptu ice skating performances that nobody particularly wanted to see. The castle's defensive capabilities were theoretically impressive, assuming anyone could actually be bothered to attack it. The steep approaches made it nearly impossible for siege engines to get close enough to be effective. Catapults would have to be positioned at such extreme angles that they'd probably launch their projectiles backward into their own operators. It was the medieval equivalent of a natural moat, except instead of water, it was filled with exhaustion and altitude sickness. However, this same defensive advantage became a logistical nightmare for the castle's inhabitants. Resupplying the fortress required elaborate planning and considerable manpower. A simple delivery of grain became a major expedition involving dozens of people and packed animals. The cost of maintaining basic supplies was astronomical, making Bere possibly the most expensive place to eat bread in all of medieval Wales. The castle's isolation also meant that communication with the outside world was painfully slow and unreliable. Messages had to be carried by messengers who were essentially medieval mountain climbers. Important news would arrive days or weeks late, by which time it was often completely irrelevant. Imagine trying to run a kingdom when your primary fortress receives updates about as frequently as a remote research station in Antarctica. Prince Llewellyn's court officials developed an elaborate system of signal fires to communicate basic information across the valleys. These beacon chains could relay simple messages relatively quickly, though the system was about as reliable as a medieval version of the telephone game played with fire. By the time a message traveled through multiple signal stations, the English are approaching from the south might become the fish are approaching from the mouth, or something equally unhelpful. The castle's chapel was built with particular attention to acoustics, creating a space where prayers would echo beautifully off the stone walls. This was lovely for religious services, but it also meant that every confession became inadvertently public. The poor priest probably heard more gossip than he ever wanted to know, simply because sound carried so dramatically throughout the building. Privacy was apparently not a major consideration in medieval castle design. Living quarters within Bere were surprisingly comfortable by medieval standards, assuming you could overlook the minor inconveniences of being trapped on a mountain peak with limited supplies and questionable weather. The royal chambers featured proper fireplaces, glazed windows, and even primitive bathroom facilities. Of course, waste disposal from a mountain castle presented its own unique challenges that we probably don't need to explore in great detail. The castle's kitchens were designed to serve elaborate feasts, complete with multiple cooking fires and extensive storage areas. However, keeping food fresh at such an isolated location required considerable creativity. The cook staff developed ingenious preservation techniques and learned to make the most of whatever supplies managed to make the journey up the mountain. Meals became exercises in creative problem solving, with menus that changed based on whatever happened to survive the trip from the valley below. As we drift deeper into the story of this magnificently impractical fortress, let the steady rhythm of medieval life wash over you. The daily routines of castle inhabitants, the gentle sounds of wind through stone corridors, and the peaceful isolation of this mountain retreat create a perfect backdrop for rest and relaxation.
Perched on the windswept cliffs of Northumberland, overlooking the grey waters of the North Sea, stands what remains of Dunstanburgh Castle. Built in the early 14th century by Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, this fortress represents one of medieval England's most spectacular examples of architectural ambition, completely divorced from practical necessity. The castle's massive gatehouse, rising nearly 80 feet above the rocky outcrop, dominates the landscape for miles around, creating an imposing silhouette that speaks of power and permanence. Yet, beneath this impressive facade lies a story of political miscalculation, strategic irrelevance, and the kind of monumental waste that would make even the most profligate medieval lord blush with embarrassment.
Thomas of Lancaster began construction of Dunstanburgh Castle in 1323 during one of the most turbulent periods of Edward II's troubled reign. As the king's cousin and most powerful baron, Lancaster commanded vast wealth and extensive lands across northern England. His decision to build a new castle on this remote stretch of Northumberland coast was driven not by military necessity, but by a complex web of political grievances, personal ambition, and what can only be described as spectacular poor judgment. The location he chose, while undeniably dramatic, was strategically meaningless. No major roads passed nearby, no important towns lay within its sphere of influence, and no significant military threats justified its construction. The site itself presented enormous challenges that any competent military engineer would have immediately recognized. The rocky promontory, while providing natural defenses on three sides, was virtually impossible to supply during times of siege. Fresh water had to be collected from rainfall or transported from distant sources. Food supplies required lengthy overland journeys across difficult terrain. The nearest friendly settlement lay more than 10 miles away, connected only by rough tracks that became impassable during winter storms. Most critically, the castle's isolation meant that it could provide no mutual support to other fortifications in the region, making it a strategic dead end rather than a link in any coherent defensive chain. Lancaster's construction project proceeded with a kind of extravagant disregard for practical considerations that characterized much of his political career. The main gatehouse, which served as both entrance and keep, was built to dimensions that rivaled the greatest royal castles of the age. Its walls, nearly 12 feet thick at the base, incorporated the finest masonry techniques available, with carefully dressed stone transported at enormous expense from quarries many miles inland. The great hall within the gatehouse featured soaring ceilings, elaborate window tracery, and decorative elements that would have been impressive in a peaceful manor house, but served no defensive purpose whatsoever. The castle's curtain wall, stretching for nearly half a mile around the clifftop perimeter, represented another triumph of ambition over common sense. Rather than following the natural contours of the rock in a way that would maximize defensive advantages, the wall was laid out in a series of straight sections that created numerous blind spots and vulnerable angles. The towers, spaced at irregular intervals determined more by the availability of suitable building sites than by any coherent defensive plan, varied wildly in size and design. Some were barely large enough to house a single guard, while others could have accommodated entire households. This inconsistency created a fortress that looked impressive from a distance, but would have been nightmarishly difficult to defend effectively. The construction workforce required for such an ambitious project in such a remote location created logistical challenges that would have tested the organizational abilities of the most capable administrators. Skilled masons, carpenters, and other craftsmen had to be recruited from across northern England and housed in temporary accommodations near the building site. Raw materials arrived by ship when weather permitted, but rough seas and treacherous landing conditions meant that delivery schedules were entirely at the mercy of natural forces. During the long winter months, work often ceased entirely, leaving expensive equipment and partially completed structures exposed to the harsh coastal climate. The financial cost of Lancaster's folly quickly spiraled beyond all reasonable bounds. Contemporary records suggest that the initial construction consumed resources equivalent to the annual income from several major estates. The ongoing expenses of maintaining a garrison, providing supplies, and keeping the fabric of such an enormous structure in good repair represented a permanent drain on Lancaster's treasury that yielded no corresponding military or economic benefits. Local communities, already struggling with the burdens of taxation and feudal obligations, found themselves pressed to provide additional labor and materials for a project that offered them no protection or advantage. Even as construction continued, the political landscape that had supposedly justified the castle's creation was shifting in ways that made the entire enterprise increasingly irrelevant. Lancaster's relationship with King Edward deteriorated steadily throughout the 1320s, culminating in open rebellion and the Earl's eventual execution in 1322, just as his great castle neared completion. The irony was profound. Lancaster had built Dunstanburgh as a symbol of his power and independence, but his political miscalculations ensured that he would never have the opportunity to use it for its intended purpose. The castle's first real test came not from external enemies, but from the very forces that Lancaster had sought to defy. Following the Earl's execution, Dunstanburgh was seized by the Crown and briefly garrisoned by royal troops. However, the practical difficulties of maintaining such a remote outpost quickly became apparent even to the king's administrators. Supply convoys struggled across the difficult terrain, garrison soldiers complained bitterly about their isolation, and the enormous costs of upkeep provided no corresponding strategic benefits. Within a few years, the castle was effectively abandoned except for a skeleton maintenance crew. The fortress that Thomas of Lancaster had envisioned as an impregnable stronghold and symbol of noble defiance had become, in less than a decade, little more than an expensive monument to political miscalculation and strategic incompetence. Its massive walls and imposing gatehouse continued to dominate the Northumberland coastline, but they protected nothing more valuable than seabirds and the occasional smuggler seeking shelter from coastal patrols. The great hall that had been designed to host magnificent feasts echoed with nothing but wind and rain, while the elaborate chambers intended for noble guests housed only mice and roosting birds.
The decline of Dunstanburgh Castle began almost as soon as its construction was completed. By the 1320s, just a decade after Thomas of Lancaster had finished his grand project, the castle was already showing signs of neglect. The irony was palpable. This fortress, built to project power and authority, was crumbling under the weight of its own impracticality.
The first major issue was maintenance. Dunstanburgh's exposed position on the Northumberland coast meant it faced constant assault from the elements. Salt spray from the North Sea corroded the stonework, while fierce winter storms battered the walls relentlessly. The castle required continuous repairs that drained resources faster than any military campaign ever could. Records from the 1330s show that maintaining Dunstanburgh cost more than 3 times the annual revenue it generated from its surrounding lands. The castle's constables regularly petitioned the crown for additional funds, citing urgent repairs to the gatehouse, walls, and residential quarters. These requests were often denied or delayed, leading to further deterioration. The strategic value of Dunstanburgh had also diminished significantly by this time. The Scottish wars that had originally justified its construction were winding down, and the border region was experiencing relative peace. The castle's primary function, defending against Scottish raids, was no longer necessary, making its enormous running costs even more difficult to justify. During the 1340s, Dunstanburgh briefly found new purpose as a refuge for local nobility during times of political upheaval. However, this use highlighted another fundamental flaw in its design. The castle's great hall, while impressive, was poorly heated and uncomfortable for extended stays. Visitors frequently complained about the cold, damp conditions that pervaded the entire structure. The Black Death's arrival in England during the late 1340s dealt another devastating blow to Dunstanburgh's prospects. The plague decimated the local population, reducing the workforce available for maintenance and the tax base that supported the castle's operations. Many of the surrounding villages that had provided supplies and services to the fortress were abandoned entirely. By the 1350s, Dunstanburgh had gained a reputation as a white elephant among English castles. Contemporary chronicles describe it as a great burden upon the realm, noting that its upkeep consumed resources that could be better spent elsewhere. The castle's isolated location made it difficult to supply, especially during winter months when roads became impassable. The architectural flaws that had been overlooked during construction became increasingly apparent as the decades passed. The castle's great gatehouse, while visually impressive, proved to be structurally unsound. Cracks appeared in the walls within 20 years of completion, requiring expensive repairs that never seemed to fully address the underlying problems. Water management was another persistent issue at Dunstanburgh. Despite its coastal location, the castle struggled with both water scarcity and flooding. The wells often ran dry during summer months, while winter storms regularly flooded the lower courtyards. The drainage systems, inadequately designed for the site's unique challenges, required constant attention and frequent replacement. The castle's garrison presented ongoing difficulties as well. Recruiting soldiers willing to serve in such an isolated and uncomfortable posting proved challenging. Those who did accept positions at Dunstanburgh often requested transfers after short periods, citing the harsh living conditions and lack of amenities. This constant turnover undermined the castle's military effectiveness and increased administrative burden. During the 1360s, several attempts were made to find alternative uses for Dunstanburgh. Proposals included converting portions of the castle into a monastery, a trading post, or even a prison. However, each of these plans foundered on the same fundamental issues that had plagued the fortress from the beginning: its remote location, harsh climate, and enormous maintenance requirements. The castle's financial records from this period make for sobering reading. Annual expenses consistently exceeded income by substantial margins, with repairs and maintenance accounting for the largest portion of costs. The constable's accounts detail a seemingly endless series of emergency repairs: collapsed roofs, crumbling walls, flooded chambers, and damaged gates. Local communities that had initially benefited from Dunstanburgh's construction began to view it as a burden. The castle's demands for supplies, labor, and taxes strained resources without providing meaningful protection or economic benefits in return. Several villages petitioned the crown to reduce their obligations to the fortress, citing hardship and declining population. The political landscape had also shifted dramatically since Dunstanburgh's construction. The centralization of royal power meant that great magnates like Thomas of Lancaster could no longer maintain private armies and fortresses with impunity. The castle's original purpose as a symbol of baronial independence had become not just irrelevant, but potentially treasonous. By the 1370s, Dunstanburgh was operating with a skeleton crew. The great hall that had once hosted lavish feasts stood empty most of the year, its massive fireplaces cold and its tapestries rotting from damp. The castle's chapel, built to serve a large community, echoed with the prayers of just a handful of residents. The fortress's military equipment tells a similar story of decline. Inventories from this period show that many of the castle's weapons were in poor condition, with rust and decay rendering them largely useless. The great siege engines that had been installed with such fanfare during construction had become little more than expensive ornaments, too corroded to function effectively. Weather damage accelerated during the 1380s, as a series of particularly harsh winters took their toll on Dunstanburgh's already weakened structures. Contemporary accounts describe ice damage to the walls, flooding in the Great Hall, and the collapse of several minor buildings within the castle complex. Each incident required repairs that further strained the already inadequate budget. The castle's isolation, originally seen as a defensive advantage, had become its greatest liability. Supply convoys struggled to reach Dunstanburgh during bad weather, sometimes leaving the garrison without adequate food or fuel for weeks at a time. This isolation also meant that skilled craftsmen were reluctant to travel to the castle for repair work, driving up costs and reducing the quality of maintenance. As the 14th century drew to a close, Dunstanburgh Castle stood as a monument to medieval miscalculation. Its massive walls and imposing gatehouse continued to dominate the Northumberland coastline, but they protected nothing more valuable than empty chambers and crumbling dreams. The fortress that had been built to project power had become a symbol of waste and impracticality. The castle's decline would only accelerate in the coming decades, as England faced new challenges that made Dunstanburgh's particular brand of obsolescence even more apparent. But even in its diminished state, the fortress continued to consume resources and attention, a persistent reminder of the dangers of building without considering long-term practicality and purpose.
Moving westward through the French countryside, we encounter another monument to medieval architectural ambition that would ultimately prove more decorative than defensive. The Château de Saumur, perched elegantly above the Loire River in the Anjou region, presents us with a fascinating case study in how changing times can render even the most thoughtfully designed fortifications utterly obsolete. Built in the 14th century on the foundations of an earlier fortress, Saumur was conceived during a period when castle design was evolving rapidly, attempting to balance traditional defensive needs with the growing demands of courtly life and administrative complexity.
The original fortress at Saumur dated back to the 10th century, established by Theobald I, Count of Blois, as a strategic stronghold controlling river traffic along the Loire. This early structure served its purpose adequately for several centuries, weathering various sieges and political upheavals that characterized the turbulent medieval period. However, by the late 13th century, the old fortress had become increasingly inadequate for the sophisticated military techniques emerging across Europe. The advent of more powerful siege engines, improved crossbow technology, and early experiments with gunpowder weapons meant that traditional castle designs were rapidly becoming obsolete. In the 1360s, Louis I of Anjou, brother to King Charles V of France, decided that the aging fortress required complete reconstruction. Louis was a man of considerable cultural refinement and political ambition, having spent time in various European courts and observed the latest developments in both military architecture and palatial design. His vision for the new Château de Saumur was remarkably ambitious, combining cutting-edge defensive features with luxurious residential quarters that would befit his status as a royal duke and demonstrate the wealth and sophistication of the Angevin court. The reconstruction project began with great fanfare and considerable expense. Louis employed some of the most skilled architects and engineers available in 14th century France, drawing inspiration from recent innovations in castle design observed in England, the Low Countries, and various Italian city-states. The new structure would feature multiple defensive rings, sophisticated gatehouse complexes, and residential quarters decorated with the finest artistic craftsmanship that money could procure. The project was intended to create not merely a fortress, but a statement of power that would intimidate enemies and impress allies throughout the Loire Valley. The architectural plan called for a complex arrangement of towers, walls, and courtyards that would theoretically provide multiple layers of defense against any conceivable attack. The main keep was designed as a massive rectangular structure, rising several stories above the surrounding walls and providing both defensive positions for archers and comfortable living spaces for the Duke and his household. Surrounding this central tower, a series of curtain walls would create enclosed courtyards where troops could muster, supplies could be stored, and daily life could continue even during extended sieges. Eastern approach to the castle, considered the most vulnerable to attack, received particular attention from the designers. Here they constructed an elaborate barbican complex featuring multiple gates, murder holes, and defensive positions that would force any attacking army to navigate a deadly maze of overlapping fields of fire. The barbican was connected to the main castle by a heavily fortified bridge spanning a deep artificial moat, which could be flooded from the Loire River during times of crisis. This arrangement was considered state-of-the-art defensive design for its era. However, even as construction proceeded through the 1370s and 1380s, the military landscape was changing with unprecedented rapidity. The 100 Years' War between England and France had accelerated the development of new siege techniques, while the increasing availability of gunpowder weapons was beginning to revolutionize the entire concept of fortification. Artillery pieces, though still primitive by later standards, were becoming sufficiently powerful to breach traditional stone walls, rendering many aspects of conventional castle design increasingly questionable. The irony of Saumur's construction timeline becomes apparent when we consider that by the time the castle neared completion in the 1390s, military engineers across Europe were already recognizing that high walls and tall towers actually made fortifications more vulnerable to cannon fire, not less. The very features that made Saumur impressive to behold, its soaring towers and elaborate decorative elements, also made it an easy target for the new artillery weapons that were rapidly spreading across European battlefields. Louis I died in 1384 before seeing his grand project completed, and the work continued under his successors with somewhat less enthusiasm and considerably less funding. The later phases of construction reflect this reduced commitment, with some planned defensive features simplified or eliminated entirely due to budget constraints. The residential quarters, however, continued to receive lavish attention, as subsequent Dukes of Anjou were more interested in the castle's potential as a luxurious palace than as a military stronghold. By the early 15th century, when construction finally concluded, the Château de Saumur represented a curious hybrid of military architecture and palatial design that satisfied neither function particularly well. As a fortress, it incorporated defensive features that were already becoming obsolete, while as a palace, it remained constrained by military considerations that limited comfort and convenience. The result was a structure that looked formidable, but offered little practical defensive advantage over simpler, less expensive alternatives. The castle's first real test came during the civil wars that plagued France in the early 15th century, as various noble factions fought for control during the mental illness of King Charles VI. The Château de Saumur changed hands several times during this period, but notably, none of these transfers of control resulted from successful sieges. Instead, the castle was typically surrendered through negotiation, bribery, or treachery, suggesting that its elaborate defensive features provided little practical deterrent to determined enemies. The most telling indication of Saumur's military inadequacy came in 1425, when English forces under the command of the Earl of Suffolk approached the castle during their Loire Valley campaign. Rather than attempting to storm the supposedly impregnable fortress, Suffolk's engineers simply positioned their artillery pieces at optimal range and began a systematic bombardment of the walls. Within 3 days, several sections of the supposedly state-of-the-art fortifications had been breached, and the garrison surrendered without attempting a prolonged defense. This rapid capitulation highlighted a fundamental problem with Saumur's design philosophy. The castle had been built according to 14th century assumptions about siege warfare, but by the 1420s, those assumptions were completely obsolete. The high walls that were meant to protect defenders instead provided excellent targets for enemy gunners, while the complex layout that was supposed to confuse attackers actually made it difficult for the garrison to coordinate their defense effectively.
The transformation of Château de Saumur into a prison represented one of history's most spectacular architectural downgrades. Imagine taking a masterpiece of Gothic architecture, complete with soaring spires and delicate stone tracery, and systematically converting it into a series of cramped, windowless cells. The process began in earnest during the early 17th century, when local authorities decided that the castle's thick walls and isolated position made it perfect for containing society's unwanted elements.
The conversion process was both methodical and heartbreaking from an architectural perspective. Workers began by subdividing the grand halls that had once hosted royal banquets into smaller compartments using rough stone walls and heavy wooden partitions. The beautiful Gothic windows, which had been designed to flood the interior with natural light, were either bricked up entirely or fitted with heavy iron bars that cast ominous shadows across the floor. The spiral staircases, once elegant pathways between floors, became narrow channels for moving prisoners between their cells and the exercise yards that had been carved out of former courtyards. What made this transformation particularly tragic was the complete disregard for the castle's artistic heritage. Elaborate stone carvings were chiseled away to make room for utilitarian fixtures. Frescoes that had adorned the walls for centuries were covered with thick coats of whitewash or simply scraped off entirely. The great fireplace in the main hall, which had been a masterwork of medieval stonework, was partially demolished to create additional cell space. Even the castle's famous astronomical clock, which had been a marvel of medieval engineering, was removed and sold to pay for the prison renovations. The daily routine within the prison walls followed a monotonous pattern that seemed designed to drain all life and energy from both the building and its inhabitants. Prisoners were awakened before dawn by the clanging of heavy keys and the shouting of guards echoing through the stone corridors. They were marched in single file to a communal area for a breakfast of thin gruel and stale bread, their footsteps creating a rhythmic shuffling sound that became the castle's new soundtrack. The morning hours were typically spent in forced labor, with prisoners working in the castle's lower levels to produce goods that would be sold to support the prison's operations. The work assignments reflected the prison's complete transformation from a place of beauty to one of pure functionality. Some prisoners spent their days in the former wine cellars, now converted into workshops where they wove coarse cloth or assembled simple wooden furniture. Others worked in what had once been the castle's magnificent kitchen, now a cramped space where they prepared the meager meals that would sustain the prison population. The most unfortunate were assigned to the dungeons, the lowest levels of the castle where they quarried stone or maintained the building's increasingly deteriorating infrastructure. The psychological impact of this environment cannot be overstated. prisoners found themselves surrounded by the remnants of former grandeur, with fragments of carved stone and patches of original decoration serving as constant reminders of what the space had once been. The contrast between the castle's glorious past and its grim present created a unique form of torment. Inmates would discover pieces of medieval pottery or fragments of stained glass while working, tangible connections to a time when the castle had been filled with music, laughter, and celebration, rather than the sounds of clanking chains and muffled sobs. The guards themselves seemed to be affected by the oppressive atmosphere that pervaded the converted castle. Many of them developed a peculiar form of institutional melancholy, moving through their duties with the same mechanical precision as the prisoners they supervised. They would patrol the corridors with heavy, measured steps, their keys jangling against their belts in a rhythm that became as predictable as a clock's ticking. Some guards reported strange dreams about the castle's former inhabitants, as if the building's history was seeping into their subconscious minds during the long, quiet hours of their night shifts. The administrative records from this period reveal the extent to which the prison had become a bureaucratic machine, processing human misery with the same efficiency that the castle had once processed royal ceremonies. Detailed logs were kept of every prisoner's daily activities, from the amount of food they consumed to the number of hours they spent in their cells. The former throne room, where medieval kings had held court and made decisions that affected entire kingdoms, was converted into a clerk's office where prison administrators shuffled papers and calculated the costs of maintaining their human cargo. Perhaps most ironically, the very features that had made Château de Saumur an ineffective military fortress made it an equally ineffective prison. The building's numerous hidden passages and secret chambers, originally designed to provide escape routes during sieges, now offered prisoners multiple opportunities for unauthorized movement within the facility. The castle's complex layout, with its maze of interconnected rooms and corridors, made it nearly impossible for guards to maintain proper surveillance of all areas simultaneously. Prisoners quickly learned to navigate these forgotten spaces, creating an underground network of communication and contraband exchange that the authorities never fully understood or controlled. The escape attempts that resulted from this architectural confusion became legendary among the prison population. One particularly notable incident involved a group of prisoners who discovered a forgotten passage that connected the former chapel to an exterior wall. They spent months carefully loosening stones and creating a tunnel that eventually allowed them to emerge outside the castle walls under cover of darkness. The escape wasn't discovered until the morning roll call, by which time the prisoners had gained several hours' head start and were never recaptured. The financial burden of maintaining Château de Saumur as a prison proved to be as problematic as its architectural challenges. The building's age and complexity required constant repairs and maintenance that stretched the prison budget to its breaking point. The heating system, such as it was, consumed enormous amounts of fuel during the winter months, while the summer brought problems with ventilation and sanitation that created health hazards for both prisoners and staff. The cost of feeding and housing the prison population, combined with the expense of maintaining the building itself, made the facility a significant drain on local government resources. By the mid-18th century, it had become clear that Château de Saumur's experiment as a prison was failing on multiple levels. The building was deteriorating faster than it could be maintained, the prisoner population was proving difficult to control, and the financial costs were becoming unsustainable. Local officials began to seriously consider alternative uses for the castle, though finding a practical purpose for such a large, complex, and historically significant building presented its own set of challenges.
In the rolling countryside of East Sussex, surrounded by peaceful meadows and gentle streams, stands what many consider the most picturesque castle in all of England. Bodiam Castle rises from its moat like something from a fairy tale, its towers perfectly reflected in the still water below. Built in the 14th century, it appears to be the very essence of medieval fortification, complete with battlements, arrow slits, and a commanding gatehouse that seems ready to repel any invader.
Yet this beautiful castle, for all its impressive appearance, represents one of the most peculiar examples of medieval military architecture. Bodiam was built not as a fortress to withstand siege, but as an elaborate statement of wealth and status disguised as a castle. Its Construction began in 1385, commissioned by Sir Edward Dallingrig, a knight who had grown wealthy through his military service in France during the Hundred Years' War. Sir Edward had been granted permission by Richard II to fortify his manor house, ostensibly to defend against French invasion. The threat was not entirely imaginary, as French raids along the English coast had been a persistent concern throughout the 14th century. However, the castle that Sir Edward built bore little resemblance to a practical defensive structure. Instead, it was designed to impress visitors with its grandeur, while providing the comfortable living quarters befitting a nobleman of his station. The most telling aspect of Bodiam's design lies in its approach to defense. While the castle appears formidable from a distance, closer inspection reveals numerous compromises that prioritize comfort and aesthetics over military necessity. The walls, though thick, are not positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. The towers, while impressive, are placed more for visual balance than strategic advantage. The entire structure seems designed to look like a castle rather than function as one. The moat surrounding Bodiam, while undeniably beautiful, serves more as a decorative water feature than a defensive barrier. Medieval moats were typically designed to be deep and difficult to cross, often filled with obstacles or stakes to impede attackers. Bodiam's moat, however, is relatively shallow, and was likely intended primarily to provide an attractive setting for the castle, while also serving the practical purpose of providing fish for the household table. The castle's entrance arrangements further reveal its true nature. While the gatehouse appears imposing with its twin towers and elaborate machicolations, the actual defensive arrangements are surprisingly weak. The portcullis, that heavy iron grating that should drop to seal the entrance, was more decorative than functional. The murder holes above, through which defenders could rain down arrows or boiling oil, were present but positioned more for show than effectiveness. Inside the castle, the layout prioritizes comfort and ceremony over defense. The Great Hall, with its large windows and elaborate fireplace, was designed for entertaining rather than withstanding siege. The private chambers were luxuriously appointed, with glazed windows that would have been vulnerable to attack but provided pleasant views of the surrounding countryside. The castle's water supply, rather than being secured within the walls, depended on the moat and nearby streams, making it vulnerable to contamination during any extended siege. The timing of Bodiam's construction is particularly revealing. By the late 14th century, the nature of warfare was changing rapidly. The longbow had proven its devastating effectiveness at battles like Crécy and Poitiers, making high walls less effective against determined attackers. Gunpowder weapons, though still in their infancy, were beginning to appear on European battlefields. The age of the traditional castle as an impregnable fortress was already drawing to a close. Sir Edward Dallingrig was well aware of these military developments, having served extensively in France where he would have witnessed the evolution of siege warfare firsthand. His decision to build Bodiam in the traditional style suggests that defense was not his primary concern. Instead, he was creating a symbol of his success and status, a visible reminder to all who saw it of his wealth and noble position. The castle's construction methods also reveal its true purpose. While genuine military fortifications were built with speed and efficiency in mind, using local materials and practical designs, Bodiam was constructed with careful attention to architectural detail. The stonework is of exceptional quality, with decorative elements that would have been unnecessary in a purely military structure. The towers are perfectly proportioned, the battlements elegantly crenellated, and the overall composition balanced like a work of art. Contemporary accounts of Bodiam's construction period reveal that Sir Edward spared no expense in creating his dream castle. He imported skilled craftsmen from across England and the continent, employed the finest stonemasons, and insisted on the highest quality materials. The project took several years to complete and consumed a substantial portion of his wealth, suggesting that this was intended as his masterpiece rather than a practical fortification. The castle's domestic arrangements further emphasize its role as a luxury residence. The kitchens were elaborate affairs designed to prepare feasts for large numbers of guests. The solar or private apartment was fitted with the finest furnishings available. The chapel was beautifully decorated, serving both spiritual needs and as another display of wealth. Every aspect of the castle's interior was designed for comfort and status rather than military efficiency. Bodiam's location also reveals much about its intended purpose. Rather than being positioned on a strategic hilltop or commanding important routes, the castle sits in a valley, surrounded by agricultural land. While this location provided a pleasant setting and good access to water, it offered no particular military advantage. An enemy force could easily surround the castle and cut off its supplies without exposing themselves to significant risk. The castle's relationship with the surrounding landscape was carefully orchestrated to create maximum visual impact. Approaching visitors would catch glimpses of the towers through the trees before the full structure was revealed, creating a sense of anticipation and wonder. The moat was designed to reflect the castle's image, doubling its apparent size and creating perfect symmetry. Even the causeway leading to the entrance was positioned to provide the most dramatic approach possible. During its early years, Bodiam served exactly as Sir Edward had intended. It became a center of local society, hosting elaborate feasts and entertainments. The castle's reputation for luxury and beauty spread throughout England, attracting visitors from across the realm. It represented the pinnacle of 14th century domestic architecture, combining the romantic appeal of a medieval castle with all the comforts of a modern residence. The irony of Bodiam's design becomes even more apparent when compared to contemporary military architecture. While Sir Edward was building his beautiful but impractical castle, military engineers across Europe were developing new approaches to fortification that would soon make traditional castles obsolete. The low, thick walls and angled bastions that would characterize Renaissance fortification were already being experimented with in response to the growing threat of gunpowder weapons.
The great hall of Bodiam Castle stretches before us, its soaring windows casting long rectangles of pale light across worn stone floors. Here, Sir Edward Dallingrig would have hosted his carefully orchestrated displays of wealth and status. The hall measures 60 feet in length, impressive by any standard. Yet its grandeur serves to highlight the castle's fundamental contradiction. Every architectural detail whispers of military might, while simultaneously revealing the building's true nature as an elaborate stage set for medieval social theater.
The hammerbeam roof construction demonstrates the finest craftsmanship of the 14th century. Each massive oak beam was selected from ancient forests, shaped by master carpenters who understood both strength and beauty. The timber joints fit together with mathematical precision, creating a ceiling that appears to float weightlessly above the hall. Yet this magnificent roof covers a space designed more for entertaining than for withstanding siege warfare. The large windows that flood the hall with natural light would have been death traps during any serious military assault. Moving through the castle's interior chambers, we encounter room after room designed for comfort rather than defense. The solar or private family quarters features delicate stone tracery around its windows and a fireplace carved with intricate heraldic designs. The chimney system throughout Bodiam represents advanced medieval engineering, with flues carefully rooted through thick walls to provide warmth without compromising structural integrity. These domestic comforts reveal the castle's true priority, creating an impressive residence that happened to look like a fortress. The kitchen complex tells its own story of peaceful intention. Located in the castle's southeast corner, the kitchens feature multiple hearths, extensive storage areas, and sophisticated ventilation systems. The pastry ovens could produce elaborate confections for grand feasts, while the main cooking hearths could roast entire oxen for important celebrations. This culinary infrastructure suggests a household focused on hospitality and entertainment rather than military preparedness. A castle designed for war would have simpler, more practical cooking arrangements. The chapel within Bodiam Castle deserves particular attention for its revealing architectural choices. The sacred space features beautiful stained glass windows and an ornate altar area that would have impressed visiting dignitaries with its religious devotion. However, the chapel's location within the castle complex prioritizes aesthetic considerations over defensive necessities. The large windows and elevated position make the chapel vulnerable to attack, suggesting that Sir Edward valued religious display over military practicality. The castle's water supply system further demonstrates its civilian orientation. Rather than relying on a simple well that could sustain a garrison during siege conditions, Bodiam features an elaborate system of channels and reservoirs designed to supply the needs of a large household living in comfort. The water flows through decorative stone channels, creating pleasant sounds and visual effects that enhance the castle's garden-like atmosphere. This sophisticated water management prioritizes luxury over the stark necessities of military defense. The Great Gatehouse of Bodiam Castle presents perhaps the most striking example of the building's theatrical military architecture. The entrance passage features multiple murder holes, arrow loops, and heavy portcullises that create an intimidating approach for any visitor. However, closer examination reveals that these defensive features were designed more for psychological impact than practical military use. The murder holes are positioned for maximum visual effect rather than optimal defensive coverage, and the arrow loops provide limited fields of fire that would be inadequate during a serious assault. The residential quarters throughout Bodiam Castle emphasize comfort and privacy in ways that would have been impossible in a genuinely military structure. Each major chamber features its own fireplace, private guardrobe facilities, and carefully designed ventilation systems. The walls are thick enough to provide excellent insulation and soundproofing, creating quiet, comfortable living spaces that rival the finest manor houses of the period. These domestic arrangements require significant compromises in defensive capability, trading military effectiveness for residential luxury. The castle's approach to food storage and preparation reveals another layer of its civilian character. The extensive cellars and storage areas were designed to support the elaborate entertaining that Sir Edward clearly envisioned for his new home. Wine cellars feature stone shelving systems for aging fine vintages, while grain storage areas include sophisticated ventilation to prevent spoilage during long-term storage. These provisions suggest a household planning for years of peaceful prosperity, rather than the uncertain supplies available during wartime conditions. The decorative elements throughout Bodiam Castle consistently prioritize beauty over military function. Stone carvings around doorways and windows feature intricate foliate designs and heraldic symbols that would have required months of skilled craftsmanship to complete. These artistic details serve no defensive purpose and actually create potential weak points in the castle's structure. However, they perfectly serve the building's true function as a magnificent backdrop for Sir Edward's social ambitions and political aspirations. The castle's heating system represents medieval domestic engineering at its finest, with carefully planned flue systems that provide warmth throughout the residential areas without creating obvious external vulnerabilities. However, the extensive chimney network required significant modifications to what might otherwise have been solid defensive walls. The comfort systems integrated throughout Bodiam demonstrate that the castle was designed from the ground up as a luxury residence, rather than a military installation that happened to include some domestic amenities. As we conclude our exploration of Bodiam Castle's interior spaces, the building's true nature becomes unmistakably clear. Every room, every corridor, every architectural detail serves the dual purpose of creating an impressive living environment while maintaining the visual appearance of military strength. Sir Edward Dallingrig succeeded brilliantly in creating a castle that looked formidable from the outside while providing all the comforts of the finest manor house within its walls. This achievement makes Bodiam Castle a masterpiece of medieval domestic architecture disguised as a military fortress.
Deep in the Loire Valley of France stands perhaps the most magnificent monument to royal vanity ever constructed. Château de Chambord, with its forest of towers and chimneys piercing the sky like stone fingers, represents the ultimate expression of Renaissance excess. Built by King Francis, the first beginning in 1519, this architectural marvel was designed not for defense, not for comfort, but purely for the king's pleasure and prestige.
The Château's construction began as Francis returned from his Italian campaigns, his mind filled with Renaissance splendor he had witnessed in the palaces of Milan and Rome. He envisioned a hunting lodge that would surpass anything his rivals possessed, a building that would demonstrate French architectural supremacy to visiting dignitaries and foreign ambassadors. What emerged from his ambitious dreams was a structure so impractical, so divorced from military necessity, that it redefined the very concept of a useless castle. Chambord's most famous feature, its double helix staircase, allegedly designed by Leonardo da Vinci himself, exemplifies the Château's prioritization of spectacle over function. This architectural wonder allows two people to ascend or descend simultaneously without ever meeting, creating an elegant dance of movement through the castle's heart. While undeniably beautiful, this staircase consumed enormous resources and space that could have been used for more practical purposes like additional living quarters or storage areas. The castle's roof terrace, a sprawling landscape of decorative chimneys, turrets, and spires, served no defensive purpose whatsoever. Instead, it functioned as an elaborate stage where the king and his courtiers could promenade while admiring the surrounding forest. Each chimney was uniquely carved, each turret carefully positioned to create the most pleasing visual effect. The terrace cost a fortune to construct and required constant maintenance, yet it contributed nothing to the castle's defensive capabilities or residential comfort. Francis I's obsession with Italian Renaissance architecture led him to incorporate features that were completely unsuited to the French climate and lifestyle. The Château's numerous windows, while allowing magnificent views of the surrounding parkland, made the interior impossible to heat during winter months. Courtiers complained constantly about the bone-chilling cold that permeated the vast halls and chambers, despite the presence of over 70 fireplaces throughout the building. The king's apartments, located on the second floor, were certainly grand but surprisingly uncomfortable for a monarch of Francis's stature. The rooms, while spacious and beautifully decorated, lacked basic amenities that would have made extended stays pleasant. There was no proper kitchen facility nearby, meaning hot meals had to be carried up multiple flights of stairs from the distant ground floor kitchen. The elaborate ceremonial chambers were designed more for impressing visitors than for actual daily living. Chambord's location in the middle of a vast forest, while perfect for hunting, created enormous logistical challenges. Every stone, every piece of timber, every luxury item had to be transported along rough forest paths from distant towns and cities. The cost of simply supplying the castle during construction was astronomical, requiring a constant stream of wagons and packed animals moving through the wilderness. Even basic necessities like food and fuel became expensive luxuries due to the remote location. The Château's famous salamander motif, Francis's personal emblem, appeared carved in stone throughout the building. While these decorative elements added to the castle's artistic beauty, they also added significantly to construction costs and time. Master craftsmen spent months carving intricate salamander designs into door frames, mantelpieces, and wall panels. Each salamander was unique, requiring individual attention from skilled artisans whose time could have been spent on more practical construction tasks. The castle's massive scale created maintenance nightmares that plagued its inhabitants for centuries. With over 400 rooms spread across multiple floors and wings, keeping the Château clean and in good repair required an army of servants. Many rooms remained perpetually unused, gathering dust and falling into disrepair while still requiring basic maintenance to prevent structural damage. The sheer size of the building made efficient heating, lighting, and cleaning virtually impossible with 16th century technology. Francis I's financial situation grew increasingly precarious as Chambord's construction costs spiraled out of control. The king had already spent enormous sums on his Italian military campaigns, and the Château's construction placed additional strain on the royal treasury. Tax increases to fund the project created resentment among French nobles and commoners alike, who questioned why their king needed such an extravagant hunting lodge while the kingdom faced more pressing needs. The construction process itself revealed the impracticality of the entire enterprise. Work progressed slowly due to the complexity of the architectural plans and the difficulty of obtaining materials in the remote forest location. Skilled craftsmen had to be housed and fed on site for months at a time, adding to the project's overall cost. Weather delays were frequent, as the exposed construction site offered little protection from rain, snow, and wind that regularly swept across the Loire Valley. Despite employing hundreds of workers simultaneously, Chambord remained unfinished throughout Francis's reign. The king died in 1547 with major portions of his dream castle still under construction. His successors continued to work sporadically, but none shared Francis's passionate commitment to the project. The Château would not reach completion until the reign of Louis XIV, over a century after construction began, by which time architectural tastes had completely changed. The castle's hunting park, enclosed by a wall stretching over 20 miles in circumference, represented another massive expense with questionable practical value. While the park did provide excellent hunting opportunities, maintaining such an enormous enclosed area required constant attention and significant financial resources. The wall itself needed regular repairs, and the park's game population had to be carefully managed to ensure good hunting for the king and his guests. Chambord's guest accommodations, while numerous, were notoriously uncomfortable by the standards of Renaissance luxury. Many visiting dignitaries complained about the cold, drafty rooms and the inconvenient layout that made moving between different areas of the castle a lengthy expedition. The Château's impressive appearance from the outside masked significant shortcomings in practical comfort and convenience that became apparent only after extended stays within its walls.
The interior of Chambord reveals even more puzzling design choices that cement its reputation as a monument to impracticality. The famous double helix staircase, while architecturally stunning, serves as perhaps the perfect metaphor for the entire castle's dysfunction. Two separate staircases wind around each other, allowing people to ascend and descend without ever meeting. It's an engineering marvel that solves a problem that never existed, much like the castle itself.
Francis I envisioned grand hunting parties where nobles could retire to their chambers without the awkward social navigation of a single staircase. The reality proved far more mundane. Guests often became lost in the labyrinthine passages, servants struggled to navigate the confusing layout, and the elaborate staircase became more of a curiosity than a functional architectural feature. Visitors today still marvel at its complexity while questioning its purpose. The castle's heating system, or rather its complete absence of one, represents another triumph of form over function. The massive stone walls that look so impressive from the outside become thermal nightmares in the French winter. Medieval castles typically featured thick walls for insulation and strategic placement of fireplaces, but Chambord's designers seemed more concerned with creating perfect symmetry than livable spaces. Contemporary accounts describe courtiers huddling around inadequate fireplaces, their breath visible in the grand halls even during supposedly festive occasions. The beautiful windows that flood the rooms with light during summer months become sources of bitter cold drafts when winter arrives. Tapestries and heavy curtains could only do so much against the fundamental design flaws that prioritized aesthetics over human comfort. The castle's kitchen arrangements reveal another layer of impracticality that would have made daily life nearly unbearable. Unlike traditional medieval castles, where kitchens were strategically placed near great halls for efficient food service, Chambord's kitchens were scattered throughout the structure with no apparent logic. Hot meals became lukewarm disappointments by the time they navigated the maze of corridors to reach their intended destination. Servants faced the impossible task of coordinating meals across multiple dining areas while food grew cold in the endless passages. The elaborate dumbwaiter systems that were installed to address these problems only created new complications. Mechanical failures were common, and the complex pulley systems required constant maintenance that was both expensive and time-consuming. The castle's famous rooftop terrace, while undeniably spectacular, serves as another example of style trumping substance. Francis intended this elaborate skyline to serve as an outdoor entertainment space where courtiers could enjoy evening air and panoramic views. The reality proved far less romantic. The exposed position made the terrace virtually unusable during inclement weather, which in the Loire Valley means most of the year. Wind patterns around the massive structure created uncomfortable downdrafts that made outdoor gatherings unpleasant even on mild days. The ornate chimneys and decorative elements that looked so impressive from ground level became obstacles to navigation on the roof itself. What was designed as an elegant social space became a windswept wasteland that few courtiers bothered to visit. The castle's water supply system represents perhaps the most fundamental oversight in its design. Unlike established medieval castles that were built around reliable water sources, Chambord's location was chosen purely for its hunting opportunities and aesthetic appeal. The nearest reliable water source required an elaborate system of pipes and pumps that frequently failed, leaving inhabitants without adequate fresh water for drinking, cooking, and basic sanitation. During dry summers, water had to be transported from distant sources, creating logistical nightmares that would have been unthinkable in a properly planned fortress. The ornate fountains and water features that were meant to demonstrate royal wealth often sat dry and useless, serving as embarrassing reminders of the castle's fundamental design flaws. The defensive capabilities of Chambord, or rather their complete absence, highlight the castle's disconnect from practical medieval military architecture. While traditional castles featured strategic positioning, thick defensive walls, and carefully planned approaches, Chambord sits exposed in open countryside with no natural defensive advantages. Its walls, while impressive, were designed for display rather than defense. The numerous large windows that make the interior so bright also make the castle completely indefensible against any serious military threat. Arrow loops and murder holes standard features in functional medieval fortifications are entirely absent from Chambord's design. The castle represents the ultimate evolution of medieval architecture away from military necessity toward pure ceremonial display. The maintenance costs associated with Chambord's elaborate design quickly became astronomical, even by royal standards. The complex roofline with its multitude of decorative elements required constant repair and replacement. Skilled craftsmen had to be maintained year-round simply to keep the ornate features from deteriorating. The specialized materials used in construction were expensive to source and difficult to work with. Financial records from the period reveal that Chambord consumed resources at an alarming rate, with maintenance costs often exceeding the annual revenues of entire provinces. The castle became a financial black hole that drained royal coffers while providing minimal practical benefit in return. Even Francis I, who commissioned the project, began to question the wisdom of his architectural ambitions as costs spiraled out of control. The castle's guest accommodations, while luxuriously appointed, suffered from the same impractical design philosophy that plagued the entire structure. Bedchambers were scattered throughout the building with no logical organization, making it nearly impossible for guests to find their way around without constant assistance. The elaborate suite arrangements that looked impressive on architectural drawings proved confusing and inconvenient in daily use. Privacy, a crucial consideration in medieval noble accommodations, was virtually non-existent due to the open design philosophy that prioritized visual impact over practical living arrangements. Sound carried throughout the stone corridors, making private conversations impossible and turning the castle into an echo chamber where every whisper became public knowledge.
Perched dramatically on a limestone cliff in the Brecon Beacons of Wales, Carreg Cennen Castle appears at first glance to be the epitome of medieval fortress design. Rising 295 feet above the River Cennen, this imposing structure seems to command respect and fear from all who approach its towering walls. The very sight of it, silhouetted against the Welsh sky, suggests tales of heroic defenses and strategic importance that would make any medieval chronicler's heart race with excitement.
Yet appearances, as we've learned throughout our journey tonight, can be profoundly deceiving. Carreg Cennen Castle, despite its magnificent setting and seemingly impregnable position, holds the dubious distinction of being one of medieval Wales' most consistently useless fortifications. Built in the 13th century, this castle would spend the majority of its existence serving as little more than an expensive stone monument to architectural ambition over practical military planning. The castle's origins trace back to around 1260, when it was constructed by John Gifford, Lord of Llandello, on behalf of the English crown. The location seemed perfect from a defensive standpoint. The limestone precipice provided natural protection on three sides, while the fourth side could be heavily fortified with walls and towers. The views from the castle walls stretched for miles across the Tywee Valley, theoretically allowing defenders to spot approaching enemies long before they could pose any real threat. However, the builders of Carreg Cennen made a fundamental error that would plague the fortress throughout its entire operational life. They prioritized dramatic visual impact over practical military considerations. The castle's position, while visually stunning and seemingly defensive, actually created more problems than it solved. The limestone cliff, though impressive, was riddled with natural caves and fissures that extended deep beneath the castle's foundation. These underground passages, which the builders either ignored or failed to properly investigate, would become the castle's greatest weakness. Rather than providing additional storage or defensive positions, the cave system beneath Carreg Cennen created a network of potential entry points that were virtually impossible to guard effectively. Any determined attacker with knowledge of the local geology could potentially bypass the castle's impressive walls entirely by accessing these subterranean routes. The castle's first major test came in 1294, during Edward I's conquest of Wales. One might expect that such a formidable-looking fortress would play a crucial role in the resistance against English expansion. Instead, Carreg Cennen surrendered without a fight. The Welsh defenders, apparently recognizing the castle's fundamental flaws, chose to abandon their position rather than attempt a defense that they knew would be futile. This bloodless capitulation set the tone for Carreg Cennen's entire military career. Time and again, when faced with serious threats, the castle's defenders would choose surrender over resistance. The fortress that looked so intimidating from a distance proved to be little more than a paper tiger when confronted with actual military pressure. Its reputation for impregnability was built entirely on appearance rather than substance. Following its capture by Edward, Carreg Cennen was granted to John Gifford, who had originally built it for the English crown. Gifford invested considerable resources in expanding and strengthening the castle, adding additional towers, reinforcing the walls, and attempting to address some of the structural weaknesses that had become apparent during its brief period of Welsh occupation. These improvements, however, would prove to be money poorly spent. The enhanced castle looked more impressive than ever, with its towering gatehouse and reinforced curtain walls creating an image of medieval might that would inspire artists and poets for centuries to come. Yet beneath this impressive facade, the fundamental problems remained unchanged. The cave system still provided potential access routes for attackers, the castle's position made it difficult to supply during extended sieges, and the limestone foundations continued to present structural challenges that no amount of additional masonry could fully address. During the early 14th century, Carreg Cennen passed through various hands as political fortunes shifted in medieval Wales. Each new owner seemed convinced that they could unlock the castle's potential, that with the right modifications or strategies, this impressive fortress could finally live up to its intimidating appearance. These optimistic new proprietors would typically invest heavily in improvements, only to discover what their predecessors had learned through bitter experience. The castle's location, while providing excellent views of the surrounding countryside, also made it a logistical nightmare to maintain. Every stone used in construction had to be hauled up the steep cliff face. Every barrel of supplies, every piece of equipment, every reinforcement had to make the same arduous journey. During times of siege, when supply lines were cut, the castle's elevated position became a liability rather than an asset. Water supply presented another persistent problem. While the castle had cisterns and attempted to collect rainwater, the limestone cliff provided limited options for reliable water sources. During extended dry periods, the garrison would find themselves rationing water while sitting in what appeared to be an impregnable fortress. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers, who noted that Carreg Cennen's defenders were more likely to surrender due to thirst than enemy action. The 14th century brought new challenges as Welsh resistance movements periodically attempted to reclaim their ancestral lands. Carreg Cennen, with its commanding position and symbolic importance, should have been a natural focus for these efforts. Instead, most Welsh leaders chose to bypass the castle entirely, recognizing that its strategic value was far outweighed by the resources required to capture and hold it effectively. When attacks did occur, they typically followed a predictable pattern. The attackers would make a show of force, perhaps launching a few arrows at the walls or setting up siege equipment in plain view of the defenders. The defenders, well aware of their castle's limitations, would engage in brief negotiations before agreeing to terms that allowed them to depart with their lives and dignity intact. The castle would change hands with minimal bloodshed and maximum ceremony. This pattern of bloodless surrenders became so established that Carreg Cennen developed something of a reputation as a gentleman's castle, where warfare was conducted with unusual courtesy and restraint. Visiting dignitaries would comment on the civilized nature of conflicts involving the fortress, apparently unaware that this civility stemmed not from noble character, but from practical recognition of the castle's military worthlessness. The castle's domestic arrangements reflected the ongoing tension between its impressive appearance and practical limitations. The Great Hall, while spacious and well-appointed, suffered from persistent dampness due to the limestone construction and exposed position. The private chambers, though elegantly designed, were difficult to heat effectively during Wales' harsh winters. Even the castle's kitchens, despite their size, struggled with ventilation problems caused by the cliffside location. Servants and garrison members frequently complained about the working conditions at Carreg Cennen. The constant dampness led to health problems, while the isolated location made it difficult to maintain adequate staffing levels. Many positions remained chronically unfilled, not due to lack of wages, but because few people were willing to endure the discomforts of daily life in this supposedly magnificent fortress.
The limestone cave beneath Carreg Cennen stretches deep into the cliff face, a natural wonder that medieval chroniclers described with mixture of awe and bewilderment. This subterranean passage, carved by centuries of water erosion, extends approximately 150 feet into the rock formation. Medieval accounts suggest the cave served as both water source and emergency escape route, though archaeological evidence for the latter remains frustratingly sparse.
During the 13th century, Welsh princes utilized this cave system as storage for grain and preserved food. The constant temperature and natural humidity created ideal conditions for long-term food preservation. Stone-carved niches along the cave walls held ceramic vessels containing salted meats, dried fruits, and various medicinal herbs. These provisions could sustain a small garrison for several months during prolonged sieges. The cave's most remarkable feature involves a natural spring that flows year-round, providing fresh water even during the driest summers. This reliable water source proved invaluable during times of conflict, when traditional wells might be poisoned or blocked by besieging forces. Medieval engineers constructed stone channels to direct this water flow throughout the castle's lower levels. Archaeological excavations in the 1970s revealed extensive medieval modifications to the cave system. Stone walls partition the natural chambers, creating separate storage areas for different types of provisions. Wooden platforms, long since rotted away, once provided elevated storage space above the cave floor. Iron brackets embedded in the limestone walls supported torches and oil lamps for illumination. The cave's defensive potential remained largely theoretical throughout Carreg Cennen's operational period. While military treatises of the era discuss underground passages as escape routes, no historical records document their actual use at this location. The cave's narrow entrance and winding passages would have made rapid evacuation extremely difficult, particularly for armed soldiers wearing full battle gear. Medieval legends surrounding the cave grew increasingly elaborate over time. Local folklore claimed the passages connected to other castles throughout Wales, forming an underground network spanning hundreds of miles. These tales, while romantically appealing, lack any factual basis. Geological surveys confirm the cave system extends only into the immediate cliff face beneath the castle. The practical challenges of cave maintenance proved considerable for medieval castellans. Constant moisture caused metal objects to rust rapidly, while organic materials suffered from persistent mold and decay. Stone containers required regular cleaning to prevent contamination of stored provisions. The cave's natural ecosystem, including bats and various insects, created additional sanitation concerns. During Edward I's conquest of Wales, English forces showed little interest in Carreg Cennen's cave system. Military engineers focused their attention on the castle's more conventional defensive features, viewing the underground passages as curiosities rather than strategic assets. This dismissive attitude reflected broader English military doctrine, which emphasized direct assault over prolonged siege warfare. The cave's role in castle operations diminished significantly after English occupation. New administrators, unfamiliar with local conditions and traditions, gradually abandoned the elaborate food storage systems developed by previous Welsh occupants. The underground chambers slowly filled with debris and standing water as maintenance routines lapsed. 15th century records describe the cave as largely abandoned, used primarily for storing broken furniture and discarded military equipment. Visiting officials complained about unpleasant odors and poor air circulation in the underground areas. The natural spring continued flowing, but its water quality suffered from accumulated debris and lack of proper channel maintenance. The cave's limestone formations created unique acoustic properties that medieval occupants found both useful and unsettling. Whispered conversations in certain chambers could be heard clearly throughout the passage system, while loud shouts in other areas produced no echo whatsoever. These acoustic anomalies contributed to supernatural legends that persisted well into the modern era. Modern spelunking expeditions reveal additional passages that medieval occupants apparently never explored fully. These deeper chambers contain no evidence of human modification or use, suggesting the castle's inhabitants focused their efforts on the more accessible areas near the main entrance. The unexplored sections remain largely untouched, preserving their natural state for contemporary researchers. The cave system's geological composition provides valuable insights into the region's ancient history. Limestone formations contain fossilized marine creatures from prehistoric seas, while mineral deposits indicate various periods of volcanic activity. These geological features, while fascinating to modern scientists, held little practical value for medieval castle builders. Contemporary visitors to Carreg Cennen can explore portions of the cave system through guided tours, though safety considerations limit access to the most stable areas. Modern lighting reveals intricate limestone formations that medieval occupants experienced only by flickering torchlight. The natural beauty of these underground chambers contrasts sharply with their mundane historical uses as storage spaces and emergency shelters. The cave's preservation owes much to its abandonment during the late medieval period. Without continued human modification and use, the natural limestone formations remained largely intact. This accidental conservation provides modern researchers with relatively pristine examples of how medieval communities adapted natural features for practical purposes. Archaeological evidence suggests the cave system influenced the castle's overall design and construction. Builders positioned certain structures to take advantage of the natural water flow from underground springs. The castle's unusual layout, with its emphasis on vertical rather than horizontal expansion, reflects adaptation to the clifftop location and underlying cave system. The relationship between Carreg Cennen Castle and its cave system exemplifies medieval pragmatism in utilizing available natural resources. While the underground passages never served the dramatic military purposes suggested by later legends, they provided essential practical benefits that enhanced the castle's long-term viability as a defensive stronghold. The cave's story continues evolving as modern research techniques reveal new details about its medieval use in natural history. Ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive archaeological methods promise future discoveries that may reshape our understanding of how this remarkable underground system functioned within the broader context of medieval Welsh castle operations.
In the sun-baked landscape of Apulia, in southeastern Italy, stands one of history's most enigmatic and arguably most useless castles. Castel del Monte rises from the barren hills like a geometric puzzle, its octagonal form cutting against the endless blue sky with mathematical precision that seems almost alien in the medieval world.
Built in the 13th century by the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, this castle defies every conventional understanding of what a medieval fortress should be. There are no moats, no drawbridges, no arrow slits, no defensive walls extending beyond the main structure. Instead, what we find is an exercise in pure architectural theory, a monument to intellectual vanity that served no practical military purpose whatsoever. Frederick II was known as Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world, a title that reflected both his intellectual brilliance and his tendency toward grandiose projects that often served little practical purpose. Castel del Monte represents perhaps the ultimate expression of this characteristic, a castle built not for defense or habitation, but as a three-dimensional mathematical theorem rendered in stone. The castle's octagonal design is repeated throughout its structure with obsessive precision. 8 sides to the main building, 8 towers at each corner, 8 rooms on each of the 2 main floors. The number 8 held deep symbolic significance in medieval numerology, representing rebirth, renewal, and the connection between the earthly and divine realms. But symbolism, however profound, does not stop arrows or siege engines. Construction began around 1240, during the height of Frederick's power as Holy Roman Emperor. The location chosen was deliberately remote, situated on a low hill that offered no particular strategic advantage. No major roads passed nearby, no important trade routes required protection, no enemy territories needed watching. The site was selected purely for its isolation and the dramatic effect the building would create against the stark landscape. The castle's walls rise to a height of 25 meters, constructed from local limestone that glows golden in the Mediterranean sun. The precision of the stonework is extraordinary, with each block cut and fitted with mathematical accuracy. The 8 towers that crown each corner are perfectly cylindrical, rising slightly above the main walls but offering no practical defensive advantage. Inside, the layout continues the octagonal theme with relentless consistency. The ground floor contains 8 trapezoidal rooms arranged around a central courtyard, each room identical in size and shape. The upper floor mirrors this arrangement exactly, creating a sense of perfect symmetry that would have appealed to Frederick's mathematical mind, but provided little comfort for any hypothetical garrison. The central courtyard is perhaps the most striking feature of the entire structure. Octagonal in shape naturally, it is surrounded by 2 stories of Gothic arches that create a play of light and shadow throughout the day. The proportions are mathematically perfect, based on classical principles of harmony and proportion that Frederick had studied during his extensive travels in the Islamic world. But this architectural perfection came at the cost of any practical utility. The rooms are too small for comfortable long-term habitation, too exposed for defensive purposes, and too isolated for administrative functions. The castle contains no great hall for receiving guests, no proper kitchens for feeding a household, no stables for horses, no barracks for soldiers. The windows of Castel del Monte tell their own story of impracticality. Large, elegantly proportioned, and completely unsuitable for defense, they were designed to frame views of the surrounding countryside rather than provide firing positions for archers. Many are positioned at heights that make them difficult to see through, suggesting they were intended more for their aesthetic effect than for any practical purpose. Frederick spared no expense in the castle's construction, importing skilled craftsmen from across his empire. Islamic geometric patterns blend with Gothic architectural elements and classical Roman proportions, creating a unique synthesis that reflects Frederick's cosmopolitan education and his position as a bridge between Christian and Islamic cultures. The decorative elements throughout the castle demonstrate this cultural fusion. Carved capitals atop columns show Islamic influence, while the pointed arches reflect Gothic sensibilities. Classical proportions govern the overall design, but the execution incorporates techniques learned from Byzantine craftsmen. The result is architecturally stunning and completely impractical. Water supply, that most basic requirement for any habitable structure, seems to have been an afterthought. The castle contains no wells, no cisterns, no apparent means of collecting or storing water. Any occupants would have been dependent on supplies brought from outside, making the castle unsuitable for withstanding even the briefest siege. The heating system, or lack thereof, presents another insurmountable problem. While the castle contains several fireplaces, they are inadequately sized and poorly positioned to heat the large stone rooms effectively. The Italian climate might make this bearable in summer, but winter occupation would have been extremely uncomfortable. Storage space is virtually non-existent throughout the castle. Medieval fortresses typically contained extensive cellars, granaries, and storerooms to support long-term occupation. Castel del Monte offers almost none of these facilities, suggesting it was never intended for extended habitation by any significant number of people. The castle's isolation compounded all these practical problems. Located miles from any significant settlement, it would have been impossible to supply regularly or to summon help in case of emergency. The very remoteness that made it dramatically impressive also made it utterly impractical as a residence or administrative center. Frederick's motivations for building such an impractical structure remain mysterious. Some historians suggest it was intended as a hunting lodge, though it lacks the facilities typically associated with such buildings. Others propose it served as an astronomical observatory, pointing to certain alignments in the architecture that correspond to celestial events. The astronomical theory gained some credence from Frederick's known interest in mathematics and natural philosophy. The castle's orientation and the placement of certain windows do seem to correspond to the positions of the sun and stars at specific times of year. But even if this was the intention, it represents an extraordinarily expensive way to build an observatory. Another theory suggests the castle was designed as a crown, a three-dimensional representation of imperial power that could be seen from great distances across the flat Apulian landscape. The octagonal form, repeated throughout the structure, might represent the eight-pointed crown of the Holy Roman Empire, making the entire building a massive piece of imperial propaganda. But propaganda, however impressive, does not justify the enormous expense and effort required to construct such a complex building in such a remote location. The castle consumed resources that could have been used for practical military or administrative purposes, representing a significant drain on the imperial treasury for no apparent strategic benefit. The construction process itself reveals the extent of Frederick's commitment to this impractical project. Skilled craftsmen were brought from across Europe and the Islamic world, exotic materials were imported at great expense, and the most advanced engineering techniques of the period were employed to realize the emperor's geometric vision. Yet despite all this effort and expense, historical records suggest that Frederick himself spent very little time at Castel del Monte. The castle appears in imperial itineraries only rarely, and this raises the disturbing possibility that the castle was built primarily as an intellectual exercise, a demonstration of what could be achieved rather than what should be achieved.
The mathematical precision of Castel del Monte extends extends far beyond its octagonal walls. Each tower, each window, each doorway follows a geometric harmony that would make Pythagoras weep with joy. Frederick II, ever the scholar, embedded golden ratios and sacred geometry into every measurement. The castle's dimensions align with astronomical calculations, its proportions reflecting the medieval understanding of cosmic order. Yet for all this mathematical beauty, the structure remained fundamentally impractical as a fortress.
Consider the castle's most peculiar feature, its complete lack of a moat, drawbridge, or any traditional defensive mechanisms. While other castles bristled with arrow slits and murder holes, Castel del Monte presented smooth walls punctuated by elegant windows. These windows, arranged in perfect symmetry, offered panoramic views of the Apulian countryside but provided no tactical advantage whatsoever. An attacking army could approach from any direction without facing a single defensive obstacle until they reached the walls themselves. The interior layout reveals even more puzzling choices. The ground floor consists of 8 trapezoidal rooms, each connected to its neighbors in a continuous circuit. This arrangement, while architecturally stunning, created a defensive nightmare. Defenders couldn't establish choke points or create overlapping fields of fire. Instead, they would find themselves running in circles, quite literally, as invaders poured through multiple entrances simultaneously. Frederick's architects seemed more concerned with acoustics than armor. The vaulted ceilings and curved walls created perfect sound chambers, allowing whispered conversations to carry clearly across rooms. This acoustic engineering suggests the castle was designed for scholarly discourse and courtly entertainment rather than military briefings and siege preparation. The emperor could hold philosophical debates with perfect audio clarity, but coordinating a defense would prove nearly impossible. The second floor mirrors the ground level's octagonal perfection, but adds another layer of impracticality. Each upper room features elaborate ribbed vaulting and decorative keystones carved with Frederick's personal symbols. These artistic flourishes required skilled craftsmen and expensive materials, resources that could have funded proper fortifications elsewhere. Instead of battlements, the castle boasted beautiful but militarily useless architectural details. Water supply presented another critical weakness. Unlike proper castles with deep wells and multiple water sources, Castel del Monte relied on rainwater collection and external springs. The castle's flat roof, while perfect for astronomical observations, offered limited water storage capacity. During a siege, defenders would face thirst long before starvation, making prolonged resistance impossible. Frederick's mathematical mind apparently overlooked this basic requirement for fortress survival. The castle's isolation compounded its defensive problems. Positioned on a hilltop with commanding views, it seemed strategically placed into one considered supply lines and reinforcement routes. The nearest major settlement lay miles away across difficult terrain. While this isolation provided privacy for Frederick's intellectual pursuits, it left the castle dangerously exposed during conflict. Help would arrive too late, if at all. Storage facilities within the castle tell another story of misplaced priorities. Instead of armories and granaries, the rooms contained libraries and laboratories. Frederick filled his octagonal chambers with books, scientific instruments, and exotic specimens from his travels. The emperor transformed what should have been a military stronghold into a medieval research institute, complete with translation workshops where Arabic texts became Latin treatises. The castle's heating system reveals similar attention to comfort over combat readiness. Sophisticated hypercost heating, borrowed from Roman engineering, kept the interior spaces warm during Apulian winters. This luxury required extensive underground infrastructure and constant fuel supplies, both vulnerabilities an enemy could exploit. A proper fortress would rely on central hearths that could be quickly extinguished if necessary, not elaborate heating networks that advertised the building's occupation. Frederick's personal apartments occupied the most defensible positions, but served ceremonial rather than strategic purposes. The emperor's chambers featured intricate mosaic floors depicting hunting scenes and mythological creatures. These artistic masterpieces required months of skilled labor and imported materials, resources desperately needed for actual fortifications throughout Frederick's territories. Beauty triumphed over pragmatism at every turn. The castle's famous spiral staircases present another architectural paradox. These elegant stone spirals, perfectly proportioned and smoothly finished, created beautiful transitions between floors. However, they also provided attackers with easy access routes once they breached the outer walls. Traditional castle staircases spiral clockwise to favor right-handed defenders swinging swords downward, but Castel del Monte's stairs prioritize aesthetic harmony over tactical advantage. Communication systems within the castle relied on visual signals and acoustic properties rather than practical military networks. The octagonal design created perfect sight lines for astronomical observations, but offered no advantages for coordinating defensive action. Guards couldn't establish overlapping patrol routes or create effective watch schedules. The mathematical precision that made the castle architecturally remarkable rendered it tactically vulnerable. Frederick's fascination with Islamic architecture influenced many design choices that further compromised defensive capabilities. The castle incorporates elements from Moorish palaces, including decorative arches and geometric patterns that serve no military purpose. These cultural borrowings reflected the emperor's cosmopolitan interests but created structural weaknesses that enemies could exploit. Beauty and scholarship took precedence over battlefield effectiveness. The surrounding landscape, while providing excellent views for stargazing, offered attackers numerous advantages. The castle sits exposed on its hilltop without natural barriers or defensive terrain features. Approaching armies could study the structure from multiple angles, identifying weak points and planning coordinated assaults. Frederick's choice of location prioritized scenic beauty and astronomical visibility over military necessity, leaving his architectural masterpiece dangerously exposed to conventional siege tactics.
Perched dramatically on the rugged cliffs of Cornwall, where the Atlantic Ocean crashes endlessly against black slate rocks, stands what remains of Tintagel Castle. This fortress, wrapped in mist and legend, represents perhaps the most romantically useless castle in all of medieval Britain. Built in the 13th century by Richard, Earl of Cornwall, Tintagel was constructed not for any practical military purpose, but as an elaborate monument to a myth that never existed.
The story begins with Geoffrey of Monmouth's fanciful Historia Regum Britanniae, written around 1136, which claimed that the legendary King Arthur was conceived at Tintagel through magical deception. According to Geoffrey's tale, other Pendragon, with the help of Merlin's sorcery, disguised himself as Duke Gorwa to seduce the Duke's wife, Igraine, in the very castle that supposedly stood on these cliffs. The problem with this romantic origin story is that no castle existed at Tintagel during the supposed Arthurian period of the 5th or 6th centuries. Archaeological evidence reveals that Tintagel was indeed an important site in post-Roman Britain, but not as a castle. Excavations have uncovered the remains of a substantial settlement dating from the 5th to 7th centuries, complete with imported Mediterranean pottery, glass vessels, and other luxury goods that suggest this was a high-status royal and monastic site. The settlement included multiple buildings, workshops, and even evidence of metalworking, indicating a thriving community that traded across vast distances. However, this prosperous Dark Age settlement bore no resemblance to the mighty fortress described in Arthurian romance. The actual buildings were modest stone and timber structures, typical of early medieval British construction. There were no towering walls, no great halls, and certainly no castle keep. The site was abandoned sometime in the 7th century, leaving only grass-covered foundations and scattered pottery shards as evidence of its former importance. Fast forward to 1233, when Richard, Earl of Cornwall and brother to King Henry III, decided to build his castle on this legendary site. Richard was one of the wealthiest men in Europe, having made his fortune from tin mining in Cornwall and strategic marriages. He was also deeply influenced by the Arthurian romances that had become wildly popular among the European nobility. The idea of building a castle where Arthur was supposedly born appealed to Richard's sense of grandeur and his desire to associate himself with legendary kingship. The location Richard chose for his castle was spectacularly unsuitable for any practical military purpose. Tintagel Headland is connected to the mainland by a narrow rocky ridge that becomes treacherous in bad weather. The headland itself is constantly battered by Atlantic storms, with winds that can reach hurricane force during winter months. The nearest freshwater source was over a mile away, requiring a dangerous journey down steep cliff paths. Supply lines would be virtually impossible to maintain during a siege, and the castle's isolation made it useless for controlling any strategic routes or territories. Despite these obvious disadvantages, Richard pressed ahead with his ambitious building project. The castle was designed in two main sections, the mainland ward built on the clifftop approach to the headland, and the island ward constructed on the headland itself. The two sections were connected by a narrow bridge spanning the rocky gap, creating one of the most dramatically situated but impractical fortresses ever built in medieval Europe. The mainland ward featured a substantial gatehouse, thick curtain walls, and residential buildings suitable for the Earl's retinue. The walls were built from local slate and sandstone, carefully fitted together without mortar in many sections, demonstrating the high quality of medieval Cornish masonry. Within these walls, Richard constructed a great hall, private chambers, and service buildings that would allow him to hold court in appropriate splendor when he chose to visit his romantic castle. The island ward, reached by crossing the precarious bridge, contained the castle's most impressive feature, a great hall built directly over the supposed site of Arthur's conception. This hall, with its massive stone walls and carefully crafted windows, was designed more as a shrine to Arthurian legend than as a practical building. The Earl spared no expense in its construction, importing skilled masons and using the finest materials available. The hall's position, jutting out over the Atlantic cliffs, created a dramatic silhouette that could be seen for miles along the Cornish coast. Construction of Tintagel Castle took nearly a decade and consumed enormous resources. Richard employed hundreds of workers, from skilled stonemasons to common laborers who carried materials up the treacherous cliff paths. The logistics of building on such an exposed site were nightmarish. Tools and materials had to be transported by sea during calm weather, then hauled up the cliffs using ropes and pulleys. During winter storms, work often stopped completely, as the site became too dangerous to access. The castle's design incorporated several features that seemed to acknowledge its impractical nature. Rather than focusing on military efficiency, the builders emphasized dramatic visual impact and symbolic meaning. Windows were larger than typical castle construction would allow, prioritizing views over defense. The Great Hall in the island ward featured elaborate decorative stonework that served no military purpose, but created an appropriately romantic atmosphere for a castle associated with Arthurian legend. Contemporary records reveal that Richard spent vast sums on Tintagel's construction, far more than would be justified by any practical military or administrative need. The castle's remote location meant it could never serve as an effective administrative center for Cornwall, and its isolation made it useless for controlling the tin mines that were the source of Richard's wealth. Instead, Tintagel functioned primarily as an expensive symbol of Richard's connection to legendary kingship and his sophisticated literary tastes. The irony of Tintagel's construction becomes even more apparent when we consider that Richard already possessed numerous practical castles throughout his territories. His primary seat at Wallingford Castle in Oxfordshire was a formidable fortress that actually served important military and administrative functions. His other properties included Berkhamsted Castle, Marlborough Castle, and extensive holdings in Germany through his position as King of the Romans. Tintagel was built not because Richard needed another castle, but because he wanted to own the legendary birthplace of Arthur. Even during its brief period of active use, Tintagel Castle proved consistently problematic. The exposed location made it uncomfortable to inhabit during Cornwall's frequent storms. Supplies had to be carefully planned and transported during favorable weather conditions. The castle's isolation meant that it could never serve as an effective base for governing Cornwall or defending the coast. Instead, it functioned primarily as an occasional retreat where Richard could indulge his romantic fantasies about Arthurian kingship. The castle's most famous feature, the Great Hall built over Arthur's supposed birthplace, exemplified its impractical nature. This magnificent room, with its soaring stone walls and dramatic clifftop position, was designed for ceremonial purposes rather than daily use. The hall's exposure to Atlantic weather made it cold, damp, and often uninhabitable during winter months. Yet Richard continued to invest in its maintenance and decoration, treating it as a sacred space rather than a practical building. Records from Richard's household accounts reveal the enormous ongoing costs of maintaining Tintagel Castle. The constant exposure to salt air and storm damage required continuous repairs to stonework, roofing, and wooden structures. The difficulty of transporting materials to the site meant that even minor repairs became major undertakings. Despite these costs, Richard rarely spent more than a few weeks per year at his romantic castle, preferring the comfort and convenience of his more practical residences.
The archaeological evidence at Tintagel. tells a story of gradual abandonment rather than dramatic conquest. By the 7th century, the imported pottery that had characterized the site's prosperity simply stops appearing in the archaeological record. The Mediterranean connections that had made Tintagel special were severing, one by one, like threads in an ancient tapestry, slowly unraveling.
What replaced this international trade network was nothing particularly impressive. Local pottery, crude by comparison to the fine wares that had once graced Tintagel's halls. Simple iron tools instead of sophisticated bronze work. The site didn't die dramatically, it simply faded, becoming less important with each passing generation, until it was little more than a memory preserved in increasingly fantastical stories. The irony of Tintagel's later fame cannot be overstated. Here was a place that had genuinely been important, genuinely been connected to wider networks of power and trade, genuinely been home to people of significance. Yet it became famous not for any of these real accomplishments, but for an entirely fictional connection to a legendary king who probably never existed, certainly never lived there, and definitely never pulled any swords from any stones. When medieval writers like Geoffrey of Monmouth began spinning their tales of Arthur in the 12th century, they needed impressive locations for their stories. Tintagel, perched dramatically on its Cornish cliff, looked the part perfectly. Never mind that it had been largely abandoned for centuries by then. Never mind that the actual historical Tintagel bore no resemblance to the magical castle of Arthurian romance. It looked mysterious and ancient, and that was enough. The medieval castle that visitors see today was built by Richard, Earl of Cornwall, in the 13th century. Richard was the brother of King Henry III and had more money than sense, which was fortunate because building a castle on Tintagel's clifftop required both enormous expense and a certain disregard for practical considerations. The site was almost impossibly difficult to access, requiring visitors to navigate narrow, treacherous paths along cliff faces that would challenge a mountain goat. Richard's castle was never intended to be a serious military fortification. It was a statement piece, a way of associating himself with the Arthurian legends that were becoming increasingly popular among the medieval nobility. He was essentially building a theme park attraction centuries before the concept existed, creating a physical manifestation of literary fantasy for the entertainment of his wealthy friends and political allies. The castle's design reflected this ornamental purpose. While it incorporated some defensive features, they were more for show than for serious military use. The Great Hall was positioned to maximize dramatic views of the coastline rather than to provide effective defense. The towers were placed for aesthetic impact rather than tactical advantage. Every architectural choice prioritized spectacle over substance. Even as a piece of medieval theater, Tintagel Castle was remarkably short-lived. Within a century of its construction, it was already falling into disrepair. The combination of harsh coastal weather and the inherent impracticality of the site meant that maintenance was both expensive and difficult. By the 14th century, large portions of the castle were already ruined. The accounts of castle constables from this period make for rather depressing reading. They repeatedly requested funds for basic repairs, only to be told that the cost was too high for a structure that served no real military or administrative purpose. Roofs collapsed and weren't replaced, walls crumbled and weren't rebuilt. The sea, which had provided such a dramatic backdrop for Richard's architectural fantasy, gradually began to reclaim the clifftop on which it stood. What makes Tintagel's decline particularly poignant is that it coincided with the height of Arthurian literature's popularity. While poets and storytellers were spinning ever more elaborate tales of Camelot and the Round Table, the actual castle that had been built to evoke these legends was literally falling apart from neglect. Reality, as usual, proved far less romantic than fiction. By the 15th century, Tintagel Castle existed primarily as a source of building materials for local residents. Stone from the castle walls found its way into farmhouses and field boundaries throughout the surrounding countryside. The Great Hall that had once hosted elaborate feasts became a convenient quarry. The towers that had been designed to evoke Arthurian grandeur were systematically dismantled for their dressed stone. This practical reuse of the castle's materials represents perhaps the most honest assessment of its true value. Stripped of romantic associations and architectural pretensions, Tintagel stones were worth exactly what they could contribute to genuinely useful building. The castle wall became a farmer's boundary. The tower became a cottage. Fiction gave way to function, and the castle found its only lasting purpose in serving the basic needs of ordinary people. The final insult to Tintagel's pretensions came from the sea itself. Coastal erosion, accelerated by the exposed nature of the site, began to literally eat away at the castle's foundation. Entire sections of the structure simply fell into the ocean, taking with them any remaining illusions about the wisdom of building castles on cliff tops for purely aesthetic reasons. Modern visitors to Tintagel often express disappointment at how little of the medieval castle remains. They arrive expecting to find something that matches the grandeur of Arthurian legend, only to discover scattered ruins that require considerable imagination to visualize as they once were. This disappointment is itself a testament to the castle's fundamental uselessness. It was built to satisfy fantasy rather than serve reality, and reality has not been kind to it. The archaeological work that has been conducted at Tintagel in recent decades has focused more on the genuinely historical Dark Age settlement than on the medieval castle ruins. This research has revealed fascinating details about early medieval trade, politics, and daily life. Ironically, the real history of the site is far more interesting than the fictional associations that made it famous, yet it's the fiction that continues to draw visitors. Perhaps the most telling detail about Tintagel Castle's uselessness is that it appears in virtually no contemporary military or political records from its period of active use. Unlike genuine military fortifications, which feature prominently in chronicles of sieges, battles, and political negotiations, Tintagel merits barely a mention in the historical sources. It was built to look important rather than to be important, and medieval chroniclers apparently saw through the pretense. The contrast between Tintagel's literary fame and its historical insignificance perfectly encapsulates the difference between useful and useless castles. Useful castles controlled territory, protected populations, and served as centers of administration and military power. They appear constantly in historical records because they mattered to the people who lived with their daily reality. Useless castles like Tintagel existed primarily in the realm of imagination, built to serve aesthetic and emotional needs rather than practical ones. Today, Tintagel Castle survives primarily as a tourist attraction, which is perhaps the most appropriate fate for a structure that was always more about appearance than substance. Visitors can walk among the ruins and imagine themselves in Arthurian legend, which is exactly what the castle was designed to facilitate. In this sense, it has finally achieved its intended purpose, though it took several centuries of decay and the development of modern tourism to make it possible. The story of Tintagel Castle serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of prioritizing romance over practicality in medieval architecture. While it's certainly true that castles served symbolic and ceremonial functions alongside their military ones, the most successful examples managed to balance these competing demands. Tintagel represents what happens when the balance tips too far toward fantasy, creating structures that are impressive to look at but fundamentally unsuited to the harsh realities of medieval life.
Now we arrive at perhaps the most ironically useless castle in all of medieval history, though technically it wasn't built in medieval times at all. Neuschwanstein Castle in Bavaria, Germany, stands as a monument to romantic delusion and architectural impracticality, commissioned by King Ludwig II of Bavaria in 1869. This fairy tale fortress was designed not for defense, not for governance, but purely as an elaborate fantasy retreat for a king who preferred dreams to reality.
Ludwig II, known as the Mad King of Bavaria, was a man utterly disconnected from the practical demands of ruling a kingdom. While his subjects dealt with the realities of a rapidly changing world, Ludwig retreated into elaborate fantasies inspired by the operas of Richard Wagner. He envisioned Neuschwanstein as a shrine to medieval romance, a place where he could escape the mundane responsibilities of kingship and live out his theatrical dreams. The castle's very name reveals its impractical nature. Neuschwanstein means new swan stone, a reference to the Swan Knight Lohengrin from Wagner's opera. This wasn't a fortress named for strategic importance or family heritage, but rather for a fictional character from a musical drama. The king's obsession with Wagner's romantic medievalism would drive every aspect of the castle's design, creating a structure that looked impressive but served no practical military or administrative purpose. Construction began in 1869 on a rugged hilltop in the Bavarian Alps, a location chosen purely for its scenic beauty rather than strategic value. The site offered no defensive advantages, no control over trade routes, no administrative benefits. It was simply a pretty spot where Ludwig could build his fantasy castle while gazing out at the surrounding mountains and forests. The architectural plans revealed the castle's fundamental uselessness from the very beginning. Instead of practical fortifications, Ludwig demanded elaborate throne rooms, artificial caves, and chambers decorated with scenes from Wagner's operas. The castle would have no real defensive walls, no proper garrison quarters, no facilities for governing a kingdom. It was designed as a stage set rather than a functional royal residence. The construction process itself demonstrated the project's impracticality. Workers had to haul massive stones and building materials up treacherous mountain paths, a logistical nightmare that consumed enormous resources for purely aesthetic purposes. The king insisted on the finest materials and most elaborate decorations, regardless of cost or practicality. Every room had to be a work of art, every surface decorated with romantic medieval imagery. As construction progressed, it became clear that Ludwig had no realistic plan for completing or using the castle. He changed designs constantly, adding new rooms and features based on his latest operatic obsessions. The throne room was designed to accommodate elaborate ceremonies that would never take place. The artificial grotto was meant to recreate scenes from Wagner's Tannhäuser, complete with colored lighting effects that served no purpose beyond theatrical spectacle. The king's financial advisors watched in horror as the castle's costs spiraled out of control. Ludwig borrowed heavily to fund his fantasy, draining the Bavarian treasury to pay for marble columns, gold leaf decorations, and elaborate murals depicting scenes from German mythology. The money spent on Neuschwanstein could have funded schools, hospitals, or actual defensive fortifications, but instead went toward creating an elaborate dollhouse for a delusional monarch. Meanwhile, the practical business of governing Bavaria suffered from Ludwig's obsession with his castle project. He spent more time reviewing architectural plans than attending to state affairs, more energy choosing wallpaper patterns than addressing his subjects' needs. The castle became a symbol of royal irresponsibility, a monument to the dangers of unchecked royal fantasy. The construction workers themselves recognized the project's absurdity. They were building rooms that would never be used, installing heating systems for a castle the king might never fully occupy, creating defensive features that were purely decorative. The castle's towers looked impressive but couldn't mount actual cannons. The walls appeared formidable but lacked the thickness needed to withstand artillery. Everything was designed for appearance rather than function. Ludwig's courtiers tried desperately to convince him to focus on more practical matters, but the king remained obsessed with his architectural fantasy. He would spend hours examining detailed plans for rooms decorated with scenes from the Nibelungenlied, while ignoring reports about his kingdom's financial difficulties. The castle had become more important to him than the realm he was supposed to govern. The irony of Neuschwanstein's construction became apparent as the project dragged on year after year. This castle, designed to celebrate medieval values and romantic ideals, was being built using the most modern construction techniques available. Steam-powered cranes hauled materials up the mountainside, while the castle's interior featured central heating and running water, luxuries that actual medieval castles never possessed. Local Bavarian nobles watched the construction with growing alarm, recognizing that their king was bankrupting the kingdom to build an elaborate toy. The castle served no defensive purpose in an age when traditional fortifications were already obsolete. It provided no administrative benefits in a time when effective governance required modern facilities and communications. It was simply an expensive monument to one man's romantic delusions. As the 1870s progressed, Ludwig's behavior became increasingly erratic, and his obsession with Neuschwanstein grew more pronounced. He would arrive at the construction site at odd hours, demanding changes to rooms that were already under construction. He insisted on secret passages and hidden chambers, not for defensive purposes, but to recreate scenes from his favorite operas. The castle was becoming a three-dimensional representation of the king's deteriorating mental state. The project's uselessness extended beyond its lack of practical function. Even as an artistic endeavor, Neuschwanstein represented a backward-looking romanticism that ignored the cultural and technological advances of the 19th century. While other European nations were embracing industrial progress and modern governance, Ludwig was spending his kingdom's resources on an elaborate medieval fantasy that served no one but himself. The construction process itself became a testament to Ludwig's detachment from practical concerns. While his kingdom faced mounting debts and political pressures, the king obsessed over minute details of his fantasy castle. He would spend hours reviewing architectural drawings, insisting on changes that served no functional purpose but satisfied his romantic vision of medieval grandeur. The castle's famous throne room exemplifies this impractical approach to construction. Ludwig designed it to replicate the Holy Grail Hall from Wagner's Parsifal, complete with elaborate Byzantine-style decorations and a ceiling painted to resemble a starry sky. The room featured precious stones, gold leaf, and intricate mosaics that took craftsmen years to complete. Yet this magnificent space served no governmental function whatsoever. Ludwig never held court there, never received foreign dignitaries in its splendor, and rarely even visited the completed room. The bedroom Ludwig designed for himself reveals the extent of his fantasy-driven thinking. The bed, carved from solid oak in elaborate Gothic revival style, took 4.5 years to complete. The room's walls depicted scenes from the legend of Tristan and Isolde, while the washstand alone cost more than most nobles spent on their entire household. Ludwig specified that the bed curtains be embroidered with swans, his personal symbol, using threads of gold and silver. This single bedroom consumed resources that could have funded entire public works projects in Munich. Meanwhile, practical considerations received minimal attention. The castle's heating system, primitive even by 19th century standards, left most rooms uncomfortably cold during Bavaria's harsh winters. The kitchen, located far from the dining areas, made serving hot meals nearly impossible. Ludwig seemed unconcerned that his guests would dine on lukewarm food in drafty halls, as long as the aesthetic elements met his exacting standards. The castle's location on the Hohenschwangau Ridge created additional construction challenges that Ludwig refused to acknowledge. Building materials had to be transported up steep mountain paths, dramatically increasing costs and construction time. The foundation work alone required blasting through solid rock, a process that took months and consumed enormous amounts of gunpowder and labor. A more practical ruler might have chosen a more accessible location, but Ludwig prioritized the dramatic mountain setting over construction efficiency. Ludwig's insistence on incorporating the latest technology, regardless of cost or necessity, further complicated the project. He demanded that the castle include electric lighting, a novelty in the 1880s that required installing a complete power generation system. The castle featured electric bells, telephone connections, and even an early form of central heating in select rooms. These modern conveniences, while impressive, served a castle that would house only one permanent resident and receive few visitors. The famous Singers' Hall, inspired by the Wartburg Castle's legendary song contests, demonstrates Ludwig's complete disconnect from reality. This enormous room, with its elaborate acoustic design and ornate decorations, was built to host musical performances that would never occur. Ludwig envisioned grand concerts and operatic performances, but his increasing reclusiveness meant the hall remained empty and silent. The space could accommodate hundreds of guests, yet Ludwig's social isolation ensured it would never fulfill its intended purpose. As construction dragged on through the 1880s, Ludwig's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would arrive at the construction site at midnight, inspecting work by torchlight and demanding changes that required tearing down recently completed sections. Workers grew accustomed to the king's nocturnal visits, during which he would pace through unfinished rooms, gesturing wildly as he described his vision for spaces that existed only in his imagination. The castle's defensive capabilities, supposedly central to its medieval inspiration, were purely decorative. The walls, while impressive in appearance, were too thin to withstand artillery bombardment. The towers, though tall and imposing, lacked proper battlements or archer positions. The moat Ludwig planned was never completed, and the drawbridge mechanism was designed more for theatrical effect than actual defense. In an age of modern warfare, Neuschwanstein offered no strategic advantage whatsoever. Ludwig's attention to theatrical details extended to every aspect of the castle's design. He installed hidden doors and secret passages, not for security purposes, but to recreate scenes from romantic operas. The castle featured mechanical devices that could create artificial rainbows in the throne room and sound effects that mimicked thunder and wind. These elaborate special effects, impressive though they were, served no purpose beyond satisfying Ludwig's operatic fantasies. The financial drain of Neuschwanstein's construction contributed significantly to Bavaria's mounting debt crisis. By 1885, the project had consumed millions of marks, forcing Ludwig to seek loans from private banks and foreign creditors. The Bavarian parliament grew increasingly concerned about the king's spending, particularly as he showed no signs of moderating his extravagant building projects. Ludwig's ministers pleaded with him to consider the kingdom's financial stability, but he dismissed their concerns as the mundane worries of unimaginative bureaucrats. The irony of Ludwig's situation became apparent as construction neared completion. The king who had built this elaborate castle as a private retreat found himself increasingly unable to enjoy it. Political pressures mounted as his eccentric behavior attracted negative attention from the German press and foreign observers. His nocturnal lifestyle and avoidance of public duties led to whispers about his mental stability, whispers that would eventually contribute to his downfall. In June 1886, just as Neuschwanstein approached completion, a commission of psychiatrists declared Ludwig mentally unfit to rule, despite never having examined him personally. The diagnosis, based largely on reports of his eccentric behavior and obsession with his building projects, provided the pretext for his removal from power. 3 days after being declared insane, Ludwig was found dead under mysterious circumstances in Lake Starnberg, bringing an abrupt end to his reign and his castle-building dreams. Ludwig's death left Neuschwanstein unfinished, a monument to royal excess and impractical dreaming. Only 15 of the planned rooms had been completed, and many of the castle's most ambitious features remained unrealized. The throne room's throne was never installed, the artificial grotto was never built, and the elaborate gardens Ludwig envisioned were never planted. The castle stood as a beautiful but incomplete testament to one man's inability to distinguish between fantasy and reality.
And so we reach the end of our leisurely journey through medieval history's most wonderfully useless castles. These magnificent failures, these architectural curiosities, these monuments to human ambition and miscalculation have taken us across centuries and continents, revealing the delightfully imperfect nature of medieval planning.
From motte and bailey castles that sank into their own foundations to elaborate fortresses built in entirely the wrong locations, we've discovered that even the most powerful lords and kings were not immune to spectacular misjudgments. These useless castles remind us that history is filled not just with great triumphs, but with equally fascinating failures. Consider the pattern we've observed throughout our exploration. Time and again, we've encountered castles that seemed perfectly reasonable on parchment, but proved utterly impractical in reality. The builders who constructed fortresses on unstable ground, the lords who chose sites with no strategic value, the architects who designed walls that couldn't withstand a gentle breeze, all of them teach us something profound about the gap between intention and execution. These useless castles also illuminate the complex social and economic realities of medieval life. The castle wasn't just a military installation, it was a symbol of power, a center of administration, a statement of wealth and authority. Sometimes the symbolic function outweighed practical considerations entirely, leading to the construction of castles that looked impressive but served no meaningful defensive purpose. The economic burden of maintaining these useless fortifications often proved as problematic as their original construction. Lords found themselves pouring resources into structures that provided no return on investment, no strategic advantage, no meaningful protection for their lands or people. Yet abandoning a castle was often seen as admitting defeat. So many continued to drain treasuries long after their uselessness became apparent. Weather and natural disasters played recurring roles in our stories, transforming well-planned fortifications into expensive ruins within years or even months of completion. Medieval builders often underestimated the power of floods, earthquakes, and simple erosion. Their confidence in stone and mortar sometimes exceeded the structural realities of their chosen location. The technological limitations of medieval construction also contributed to many of our useless castles. Without modern surveying techniques, geological knowledge, or engineering principles, builders relied heavily on experience and guesswork. When those proved insufficient, the results were often spectacularly inadequate fortifications. Political changes frequently rendered castles obsolete before they could serve their intended purpose. Borders shifted, alliances changed, enemies became friends, and suddenly a strategically positioned fortress found itself protecting nothing more significant than sheep pastures. The rapid pace of medieval political upheaval meant that military planning often couldn't keep pace with changing realities. Perhaps most intriguingly, some of our useless castles failed because they succeeded too well at being impressive. Elaborate designs meant to intimidate enemies sometimes proved so complex that they couldn't be properly maintained or effectively defended. The pursuit of architectural grandeur occasionally undermined basic military functionality. The human stories embedded in these failures remind us that medieval people were not so different from ourselves. They faced budget constraints, dealt with incompetent contractors, struggled with unrealistic deadlines, and sometimes simply made poor decisions under pressure. Their failures humanize an era often portrayed in overly romanticized terms. These useless castles have left us with valuable archaeological evidence about medieval construction techniques, daily life, and social organization. Even in failure, they continue to teach us about the past. Ruins often preserve details that successful, continuously occupied structures have lost through centuries of renovation and modernization. The stories we've shared tonight also highlight the importance of practical knowledge in medieval society. The most successful castle builders were those who combined theoretical understanding with hands-on experience, who consulted local experts about soil conditions and weather patterns, who prioritized function alongside form. As we conclude our exploration, remember that these useless castles represent more than mere historical curiosities. They embody the eternal human tendency to reach beyond our grasp, to attempt projects that exceed our current capabilities, to dream bigger than our resources allow. In their failures, we recognize something fundamentally human. The medieval world was built through trial and error, success and failure, brilliant innovations and spectacular mistakes. These useless castles remind us that progress often comes through learning from what doesn't work, that failure can be as instructive as success, that even the most carefully planned projects can go wonderfully, memorably wrong. So as you drift towards sleep, perhaps you'll dream of these magnificent failures, these architectural adventures, these monuments to medieval ambition and human fallibility. In the gentle rhythm of history's quieter moments, in the soft whisper of ancient stones settling into ruin, find the peaceful rest that comes from understanding that imperfection, too, has its place in the grand tapestry of human experience. Sweet dreams, and thank you for joining us on this meandering journey through medieval history's most delightfully useless castles.